They say Southern hospitality is about making people feel welcome. If you look closely, it is actually the most polite way to hide a knife. I stood near the head table of the Charleston Heritage Club, listening to a heavy crystal award shatter across the polished hardwood floor. The sharp sound echoed through the cavernous ballroom, freezing the polite applause of 200 high society guests. The crystal shards scattered across the floor, glittering under the glow of three ornate chandeliers. On the stage, my older sister Caroline clutched the mahogany podium. Her knuckles were bone white. Her chest heaved in rapid, shallow breaths inside her custom emerald silk gown. She stared up at the 20-foot projector screen behind her, which was currently broadcasting a raw, unfiltered video she never knew existed. The video showed my late husband speaking directly to the camera, exposing every calculated lie my sister had spun for the past 6 months. The audio echoed through the surround sound speakers, leaving no room for her usual excuses. Next to me, the state governor lowered his champagne glass, his practiced political smile fading into a tight line of shock. The wealthy donors who had just written checks based on Caroline's fabricated stories began murmuring, exchanging horrified glances. The silence in the room was so thick it felt hard to breathe. Then, the gold leaf double doors at the back of the room swung open. Two state investigators walked in their dark suits, a stark contrast to the bright floral arrangements of the gala. My brother-in-law Bennett took one look at the badges clipped to their belts and took a frantic step backward, bumping into a waiter and sending a silver tray crashing to the floor. The trap had sprung flawlessly, locking them in a public cage built from their own ambition. Before I tell you why my own flesh and blood tried to steal my dead husband's life work right in front of the South Carolina elite, please hit that like and subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me your age, your city, and what time it is there right now. Welcome to Zara Told Stories. I always love seeing where my listeners are tuning in from. Now let me take you back exactly 3 weeks. To the humid Thursday afternoon, when I realized my family was orchestrating a hostile takeover of my grief. August in Charleston is a specific kind of suffocating. The heat wraps around your throat the second you step outside, and the scent of Confederate jasmine hangs thick in the air. I navigated the cobblestone streets downtown, gripping the steering wheel of my car until my fingers ached. It had been barely 2 months since David's heart gave out. 2 months of well-meaning neighbors dropping off casseroles and offering sympathetic tilts of their heads. David was the kind of man who filled a room just by standing in it. He spent the last 10 years of his life building the Low Country Youth Literacy Project, from a single folding table in a community center into a statewide foundation. He built it. I stood beside him, archiving the historical records, writing the grants, and organizing the rural outreach while he charmed the donors. Now he was gone, and I was supposed to finalize the details for his memorial gala. I pulled into the valet circle at the Oak Point Country Club. The air conditioning inside the lobby offered instant relief, but the knot in my stomach only tightened. I carried a leather binder containing David's handwritten notes, his favorite catering choices, and a list of the teachers he wanted honored at the event. I pushed open the frosted glass doors of the Magnolia Room, ready to meet with the event planner. I did not expect to find Caroline already sitting at the head of the mahogany conference table. My sister looked immaculate. She always did. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out, defying the coastal humidity, and she wore a tailored linen dress that probably cost more than my first car. Beside her sat Jillian, the club's event coordinator, who looked up with the expression of a hostage. "Katie, darling," Caroline purred. She stood and wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a brief, perfumed squeeze. The hug felt like a bracket tightening around my ribs. "You look so tired." I told Jillian we should just handle the heavy lifting today. You do not need to stress yourself with seating charts. I stepped back, creating an inch of breathing room. "I am not stressed, Caroline. I have the files right here." I sat down and opened my binder. Jillian cleared her throat and pushed a tablet across the table. "We were just discussing the floral arrangements, Kathleen. Your sister suggested white roses for the centerpieces." I stared at the screen. David hated white roses. He said they looked like a dentist waiting room. He wanted blue hydrangeas. We wrote it down months ago when we first talked about the annual fundraiser. Blue hydrangeas wilt so terribly in the heat, Caroline said. She took a slow sip of her sparkling water. Plus, white roses photograph much better for the society pages. The lighting in this ballroom can cast a strange shadow on blue flowers, and we want the photos to look pristine. This is a memorial for David, I said, keeping my tone even. It is not a photo shoot. Caroline offered a thin, patronizing smile, the kind of smile she used when dealing with a toddler throwing a tantrum. Sweetheart, the donors need to see a polished event. David would want us to project stability. Let me handle the aesthetics. You just focus on healing. I looked down at the table. My eyes caught a stack of ivory cardstock resting near Caroline's elbow. The textured paper bore the gold foil crest of the charity. It was the proof for the gala programs. I reached out and pulled the top card toward me. The knot in my stomach turned into a block of ice. At the top of the program, under a sweeping, elegant font, read the title, Low Country Youth Literacy Project Memorial Gala. Below that, in equally prominent lettering, was the dedication, honoring the vision of founder David Thompson and co-founder Caroline Prescott. I read the words 3 times. The letters seemed to blur, then sharpen. Co-founder. What is this? I asked. My voice sounded hollow, detached from my body. Caroline did not flinch. She elegantly crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap. It is the program draft, Katie. Jillian did a wonderful job with the layout. You are not the co-founder, I said. I looked up, meeting her gaze. You never attended a single board meeting. You never volunteered. You only showed up to the annual dinners to drink the free champagne and mingle with the politicians. Jillian, the event planner, suddenly found the floor tiles very interesting. She began shuffling her notes, pretending not to exist. Caroline sighed. It was a practiced, dramatic sound. Katie, your memory is just clouded by the trauma right now. Who introduced David to the mayor? Who helped him secure the permit for the downtown office? I was instrumental in getting this charity off the ground. You made one phone call 5 years ago, I said. My pulse pounded against my temples. David and I built this. If anyone is a co-founder, it is me. And my name is not even on this page. Because you are the grieving widow, Caroline replied, her tone shifting from sweet to sharp. People do not want to see you paraded around as a business partner. They want to see you mourn gracefully. I am stepping up to bear the administrative burden for you. You are just too emotional to see clearly right now. She reached across the table and placed her manicured hand over mine. Her skin was freezing. I'm trying to protect you. I stared at her hand. Then I looked at the ivory cardstock. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a calculated rewrite of history. She was taking my husband's legacy and trying it on like a new designer coat. She wanted the social currency of his good deeds without ever getting dirt on her hands. Take it off, I said. I pulled my hand away from hers. I want the programs reprinted. Just David. Caroline held my gaze for a long, terrible moment. The sisterly facade slipped, revealing the cold ambition she usually saved for her country club rivals. She picked up the program draft and slipped it into her designer tote bag. I will talk to the printer, she murmured. But Katie, you need to realize that you are alienating the only people trying to help you. Do not let your grief turn you bitter. She stood up, smoothed her skirt, and walked out of the magnolia room, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and unspoken threats in her wake. I sat alone at the mahogany table, listening to the click of her heels fade down the hallway. I was an archivist. My entire career was built on preserving the truth, guarding historical records from erosion and revision. I knew exactly what my sister was attempting to do. She thought I was weak. She thought the grief had hollowed me out, left me fragile and compliant. She expected me to fold my hands, stay quiet, and let her rewrite my life. I closed David's leather binder. The trembling in my fingers finally stopped, replaced by a sharp, chilling clarity. If she wanted to treat my husband's legacy like a hostile takeover, she was about to learn just how fiercely a widow could fight back. But I had no idea how deep her betrayal ran. The fake title on the program was just the surface. Her real crime was waiting for me the very next morning at the downtown post office. The morning after the country club incident, The Charleston heat returned with a vengeance, baking the coastal pavement and turning the air into a heavy, damp blanket. I woke up in an empty house. The silence was the hardest part of losing David. For 10 years, our mornings were filled with the sound of coffee grinding, the rustle of grant applications being sorted, and his deep, booming laugh echoing off the kitchen tiles. Now there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the lingering scent of his aftershave fading from the hallway. I needed to get back to work. The Low Country Youth Literacy Project was not just a tribute to my husband. It was a lifeline for dozens of rural schools relying on our funding to keep their after-school reading programs alive. If I let the grief paralyze me, those kids would lose their safe space. And I could not let Caroline use my mourning as a stepping stone for her social climbing. To understand my sister, you have to understand the house we grew up in. Our parents treated appearances as the only currency that mattered in South Carolina society. Caroline figured out the exchange rate early. She was the golden child engineered for high society. She married Bennett, a man whose real estate empire was built on buying up generational coastal land and transforming it into exclusive gated fortresses. Caroline wore designer pearls and hosted charity galas, where the entry fee was 10 times the amount actually donated to the cause. I took a different path. I became a historical archivist. I preferred the quiet company of century-old documents, the smell of binding glue, and the undeniable truth of written records. I chose David, a man who cared more about putting books into the hands of underprivileged children than getting his name in the local lifestyle magazine. Caroline always viewed my life as a quaint little hobby, a cute distraction until I decided to join the real world. I drank my coffee black, gathered my keys, and drove downtown to the historic Broad Street Post Office. The charity operated primarily out of a P.O. box. It was a central hub for our corporate sponsored checks, handwritten letters from teachers, and grant renewal forms. As I parked my car under the shade of a massive live oak tree, I mentally prepared a list of deposits I needed to make. The summer reading programs required immediate funding. The post office was a relic of older times, with high vaulted ceilings echoing marble floors and walls lined with hundreds of polished brass lockboxes. The air conditioning inside hummed loudly, struggling against the southern summer. I walked over to box 402, pulling the small brass key from my ring. My fingers slid the key into the slot and I turned it. The familiar click echoed in the quiet hall. I pulled the small metal door open. It was empty. I stood there staring into the dark, rectangular void. I reached my hand inside, feeling the cold metal back just to be sure. Nothing. This was the third week in a row the box had been entirely empty. In the height of our summer fundraising drive, that was a statistical impossibility. We received daily correspondence. Even on slow weeks, there were bank statements or community newsletters. A cold prickle of unease started at the base of my neck. I closed the brass door and walked up to the main counter. Behind the plexiglass partition sat Martha, a postal clerk who had worked there for 20 years. She knew David well. She used to save the special literary-themed stamps just for our outgoing mail. When Martha saw me approaching, her welcoming smile faltered, slipping into a tight, awkward line. She offered me the specific brand of pity reserved for widows in small southern towns. "Morning, Kathleen," Martha said, her voice dropping an octave into a hushed, reverent whisper. "How are you holding up, honey?" "I am managing, Martha. Thank you," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "I am a little confused, though. I just checked box 402 and it is empty again. Are they holding our mail in the back room due to volume?" Martha shifted her weight, averting her eyes to the computer monitor on her desk. She reached under the counter and pulled out a single glossy grocery store circular, handing it across the counter. "This is all that came through for that name today, sweetheart," she murmured. I looked at the junk mail flyer. "Martha, this does not make sense. We are in the middle of our funding quarter. We should have dozens of envelopes. Are you sure there is no overflow bin?" Martha gave me a look of deep, uncomfortable pity. She reached out and patted my hand, resting on the counter. "Bless your heart, Katie. I thought you knew." "Knew what I asked." My voice sounded thin, echoing off the marble walls. The mail is not coming here anymore, Martha explained, clicking her mouse a few times. The system shows a formal change of address was filed 3 weeks ago. All correspondence for the Low Country Youth Literacy Project is being permanently redirected. Redirected where I demanded. Martha squinted at her screen. To a residential address in Mount Pleasant. The sender authorized all corporate checks, donor letters, and tax documents to be forwarded directly to that location. The blood drained from my face. Mount Pleasant. Caroline and Bennett lived in a sprawling gated estate in Mount Pleasant. Martha, can you print me a copy of that authorization form? I asked. My hands were shaking, but I locked my knees to keep from swaying. She frowned, looking concerned. I really should not, since you were not the one who filed it, but given your circumstances, I suppose I can print the public record copy. A minute later, the printer behind her whirred to life. She slid a single sheet of paper across the counter. I stared at the black ink. It was an official federal change of address form. Under the section requiring the signature of the organization president, the ink looped in a crisp, familiar cursive. It was Caroline's handwriting. She had legally signed the document declaring herself the primary point of contact for the foundation. Thank you, Martha, I said, sliding the paper into my bag. I walked out of the post office, the heavy summer heat hitting me like a physical blow. The world felt tilted off its axis. My sister had not just hijacked the gala planning. She had cut the central artery of the organization. By redirecting the mail, she controlled the incoming funds, the donor relationships, and the bank statements. She had effectively blinded me to my own charity. I got into my car and slammed the door. The interior was sweltering, but I did not turn on the engine. I pulled out my phone and dialed Caroline's number. She answered on the second ring. The background noise sounded like the soft instrumental music of her favorite luxury day spa. Katie, darling, Caroline answered, her voice bright and unbothered. I was just thinking about you. Did you find a dress for the gala yet? Black is traditional, but you really should try something with a navy undertone to avoid looking too washed out. You changed the mailing address, I said. I did not raise my voice. The quietness of my tone carried more weight than a scream. The spa music in the background seemed to pause. There was a brief stretch of silence. When Caroline spoke again, the sweet sisterly facade was gone, replaced by the sharp, calculating tone of a corporate negotiator. I implemented a security measure, Katie. A security measure, I repeated, gripping the steering wheel. You forged a federal postal document to steal my mail. That is a crime, Caroline. Do not be melodramatic, she scoffed. I am an authorized representative of the family. I am stepping in because you are clearly overwhelmed. I'm not overwhelmed. I am the director of this foundation. Are you? Caroline asked. Her voice dropped, turning lethal and cold. Because you have been walking around like a ghost for 2 months. You forgot to pay your own water bill last week. Bennett had to send his assistant over to sort it out for you. You are disorganized. You are grieving. The charity cannot afford dropped balls right now. You are intercepting donor checks, I shot back. You are taking money meant for children. I am securing the assets, she corrected smoothly. Until you are in a proper state of mind, someone needs to ensure the funds are logged correctly. Bennett's accountant is keeping a pristine record of everything. You should be thanking us for taking this burden off your shoulders. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my chest. Bennett. This was not just Caroline wanting her name on a fancy program. Bennett was involved. A wealthy real estate developer stepping in to manage a highly lucrative nonprofit bank account. The implications were terrifying. I am driving to your house right now to pick up every single piece of mail you took, I said, starting the engine. I would not do that if I were you, Katie, Caroline replied. The silkiness returned to her voice, hiding the venom. If you cause a scene, if you show up here making wild accusations, I will have no choice but to protect David's legacy. I will call an emergency meeting with the board of directors. I will tell them you are having a mental breakdown. I will tell them you are paranoid and unfit to serve. She paused, letting the threat hang in the stifling air of my car. They all know how fragile you have been. She continued softly. Who do you think they will believe? The successful stable sister trying to help, or the hysterical widow screaming about stolen mail? I stared at the dashboard, my vision tunneling. She had laid a perfect trap. If I fought her wildly, I proved her point. If I stayed silent, she kept the power. "We expect you at Sunday dinner tomorrow," Caroline added cheerfully, returning to her polite Southern persona. "Bennett is grilling steaks. Do not be late, Katie. It is mandatory family time." She ended the call. The line went dead. I sat in the sweltering car, staring at the printed change of address form on my passenger seat. Caroline thought she had me cornered. She thought my grief made me a passive victim. But as a historical archivist, I knew a fundamental truth about people who try to erase the past. They always leave a paper trail. I put the car in gear. I was going to Sunday dinner. And I was going to start digging. Sunday dinners in the South are a spectator sport. The battleground is usually a dining room table covered in inherited silver, and the weapons are backhanded compliments delivered with a sweet iced tea smile. I pulled my car up to the wrought iron gates of Bennett and Caroline's estate in Mount Pleasant. The dark iron gates parted slowly, revealing a winding driveway lined with towering palmetto trees and perfectly manicured Bermuda grass. The estate was a sprawling colonial monstrosity built on the profits of coastal gentrification. This was where my sister hosted her weekly family gatherings. Today it felt like driving into a predator den. I parked near a stone fountain that bubbled with excessive wealth. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel for a long moment before I forced myself to step out into the humid late afternoon heat. I had to play this perfectly. If I showed up furious demanding the stolen mail, Caroline would use my anger as proof of my instability. I needed to smile. I needed to act like the broken widow they desperately wanted me to be, while I figured out exactly how deep their corruption went. The front door swung open before I even reached the porch steps. Bennett stood in the doorway, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of amber bourbon. He wore a crisp linen shirt and a silver watch that cost more than a rural teacher's annual salary. Bennett made his fortune bulldozing generational farmland and replacing it with luxury coastal condominiums. He viewed every interaction in life as a transaction. He viewed me as a depreciating asset. "Katie," he drawled, projecting his booming voice across the veranda. "Glad you made it out of the house. We were starting to think you turned into a hermit." I forced my lips to curve upward into a practiced, polite shape. "Thank you for having me, Bennett." He ushered me inside. The house smelled of expensive hickory smoke from the backyard grill mixed with Caroline's heavy floral perfume. The central air conditioning blasted against my skin, causing a sudden shiver to run down my spine. From the dining room, I could hear the clinking of fine china and the low murmur of guests. Caroline loved an audience. She always invited a handful of local socialites or business partners to these Sunday dinners under the guise of fellowship. I slipped past the grand foyer and headed straight for the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The kitchen was a pristine expanse of white marble and stainless steel appliances that looked like they had never been used to actually cook a meal. I leaned against the cool granite island, pouring myself a glass of tap water. My heart hammered against my ribs. I kept replaying the image of that forged change of address form in my mind. The heavy wooden door swung shut behind me. Bennett walked into the kitchen, the ice clinking loudly in his bourbon glass. He did not go back to his dinner guests. He walked deliberately toward me, cornering me between the massive gas stove and the island. "I have been meaning to talk to you, Katie," he said, taking a slow sip of his drink. His eyes scanned my face, searching for weakness. "Caroline tells me you are having a rough time keeping up with the daily chores. Bills slipping through the cracks. Mail piling up." I took a slow breath, gripping my water glass to hide the slight tremor in my fingers. "I am doing fine, Bennett. Caroline is just being overly protective." He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Well, she worries. We both do. Which is why I want to do you a favor. I drove past your place on Thursday and saw David's old truck sitting in the driveway. The green one." My grip on the glass tightened. The 1968 Ford F-100. It was David's pride and joy. He spent 3 years restoring the engine on weekends, pulling it apart, and putting it back together with grease-stained hands. It was immaculate. It was not just a vehicle. It was a piece of him. "It is gathering dust." Bennett continued waving his hand dismissively. You do not need that old rusted thing sitting around reminding you of him every time you look out the window. It is bad for the grieving process. I have a buddy who tinkers with scrap cars. I will take it off your hands for $2,000. Cash. Consider it a favor to help you clear up some driveway space. $2,000. The truck was worth at least $40,000 to a serious vintage collector. The sheer audacity of his lowball offer felt like a physical slap to the face. He was not trying to help me heal. He was trying to rob a widow blind, assuming I was too stupid or too heartbroken to know the true value of my own property. I looked him dead in the eye, keeping my voice low and steady. The truck is not for sale, Bennett. His patronizing smile faltered slightly. The corners of his mouth turned down, revealing a flash of irritation. Now, Katie, do not be stubborn. You are holding on to things you cannot manage, just like the charity. And there it was, the pivot. The real reason he followed me into the kitchen. The vintage truck was just the opening negotiation to test my boundaries. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of his expensive bourbon was suffocating. You need to step down from the Low Country Youth Literacy Project, he said. His tone was no longer friendly. It was a cold directive from a man used to giving orders. The administrative burden is clearly too much for you right now. Caroline has already taken over the mail and the primary donor communications. You just need to make it official and resign. Let her handle the stress. David and I built that foundation, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It is not something I am just going to walk away from. Bennett sighed, shaking his head as if I were a slow child failing a simple math problem. You do not understand how these things work on a corporate level, Katie. David was a dreamer, but he lacked strategic vision. Do you know how much untapped potential is sitting in your organization right now? What do you mean by potential? I asked, playing the role of the confused, naive sister-in-law. He took the bait. His ego could not resist an opportunity to brag about his own brilliance. I mean the network he boasted, taking another sip of his drink. We hosted that fundraising dinner for your little literacy project last year. Do you remember who sat at my table? The regional director of coastal zoning, a man who writes the rules for my industry. He leaned against the marble counter, a smug look settling over his face. By tapping into your charity mailing list, Caroline managed to secure a meeting for me with that zoning commissioner last week. The man never returned my calls before. But the second Caroline reached out using the foundation letterhead to discuss a community partnership. Suddenly his door was wide open. I closed a land acquisition deal yesterday that will net my firm millions, all because your donor list is a gold mine of political capital. The air in the kitchen seemed to vanish. My lungs burned as I absorbed his words. The redirected mail was not just about Caroline wanting to play the savior. It was not just about her fragile ego or securing a fancy title on a gala program. It was a coordinated extraction. Bennett was using my husband's life work as a Trojan horse to access high-level government officials and wealthy investors. The Low Country Youth Literacy Project was a nonprofit built to teach underprivileged children how to read. Bennett was treating it like a tax-deductible networking pool for his luxury real estate developments. You are using David's donors for your corporate deals, I said, stating it not as a question but as a final damning fact. Bennett shrugged, totally unashamed. It is called Synergy, Katie. Everyone wins. The charity gets a small check to buy some books, and I get the zoning permits I need to break ground on a new resort. That is why you need to step down. Caroline understands how to leverage these relationships. You do not. You are too emotional. Just let the adults handle the business from now on. He patted my shoulder, a heavy, condescending touch that made my skin crawl. Then he turned and walked out of the kitchen, returning to the dining room to entertain his wealthy guests. I stood alone in the pristine marble room. The passive, heavy grief that had weighed me down for 2 long months burned away in an instant. It was replaced by a cold, calculating fury, the kind of anger that does not scream or throw plates, the kind of anger that builds empires or burns them to the ground. They were turning David's legacy into a corrupt tool for their own greed. They were bleeding the integrity of his foundation dry, and they expected me to smile and thank them for the privilege. I set my water glass on the granite counter. I did not go into the dining room. I did not sit down for Sunday dinner. I walked straight out the back door across the manicured lawn and got into my car. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet peace of the wealthy neighborhood. Bennett thought he was untouchable because he had money and political connections. Caroline thought she was safe because she had successfully hijacked the mail and the public narrative. But they had both underestimated the woman they were dealing with. They saw a weeping widow. They forgot I was a professional historical archivist. My entire life was dedicated to finding buried truths in mountains of paperwork. If Bennett was using the foundation letterhead to broker real estate deals, there had to be a paper trail. Caroline could intercept the physical mail, but she could not erase the digital footprint. David kept meticulous records. Every letter, every grant proposal, every tax document was backed up on a shared cloud drive he managed from his home office. I gripped the steering wheel as I sped down the coastal highway back toward my empty house. I did not just need to stop my sister. I needed to destroy her credibility so thoroughly that she could never use my husband's name again. I was going to tear down their carefully constructed southern facade brick by brick. As I pulled into my driveway, the sight of David's green vintage truck filled me with a sudden fierce resolve. Bennett wanted to steal this truck for pennies. He was about to learn a very hard lesson about value and leverage. I unlocked the front door and walked straight down the hallway, ignoring the crushing silence of the house. I pushed open the heavy oak door to David's home office. The room smelled of old paper and familiar leather. His computer sat on the desk, a silent guardian of 1,000 hidden secrets. I reached out and pressed the power button. It was time to find out exactly what Caroline had been writing in my husband's name. I closed the heavy oak door of David's home office, shutting out the rest of the world. The room sat frozen in time. The air inside held a distinct familiar scent of aged leather bookbinding glue and the faint metallic tang of a computer processor that used to run late into the night. Dust motes drifted through the late afternoon sunlight, filtering through the plantation shutters. I stood in the center of the room, letting the silence wash over me. For the past 2 months, I had avoided this space. It felt too sacred, too heavy, with the ghost of the man who built a statewide charity from this very desk. I approached the dark mahogany workspace. My hands brushed over the scattered architectural sketches and printed grant proposals David had been reviewing the week his heart failed. I needed access to the charity cloud drive. Caroline and Bennett thought they were clever by intercepting the physical mail and leveraging the donor lists for real estate deals. But they were arrogant. They assumed my grief rendered me blind. They forgot that my entire professional career as a historical archivist was dedicated to finding buried records, recovering erased histories, and tracking the truth through mountains of paperwork. I reached down to open the bottom right drawer, hoping to find his backup external hard drive. The metal drawer glided open on its tracks. Instead of a hard drive, my eyes fell on a small square glass bottle tucked into the corner. My breath caught in my throat. It was his daily cologne. I picked up the glass bottle, feeling the cool, heavy weight in my palm. My thumb brushed the silver cap. Without thinking, I pulled the lid off and held it to my face. The scent of sandalwood and sea salt hit my senses with devastating force. My knees gave out. I sank into the leather desk chair, clutching the bottle to my chest. A ragged sob tore from my throat, echoing in the quiet room. The loss was suddenly so vivid, so immediate, it felt like my ribs were cracking open. I could almost hear his deep, booming laugh, see the way his eyes crinkled when he solved a complex funding issue. He loved those kids. He poured every ounce of his soul into making sure the youth of South Carolina had a safe place to learn and grow. I sat there letting the tears stream down my face, honoring the profound love that anchored my life. But the wave of sorrow eventually crested and began to recede. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. The lingering scent of sandalwood did not weaken me. It fueled the fire burning in my chest. I set the glass bottle carefully on the edge of the desk. I reached out and pressed the power button on the computer tower. The monitor hummed to life, casting a cool blue glow across the mahogany wood. I typed in the administrative password, a combination of our wedding anniversary and the zip code of his first youth center. The home screen appeared instantly. I navigated straight to the organization's shared cloud directory. My sister possessed the ruthless cunning of a social climber, but she lacked the technical discipline of a digital historian. Caroline assumed dragging files to a computer trash bin erased them from existence. She did not understand the architecture of cloud-based version histories. She did not realize that every change, every edit, and every deletion left a permanent digital fingerprint. I opened the folder labeled Outgoing Correspondence. At first glance, the directory looked pristine. The recent folders were organized and labeled with Caroline's typical obsessive neatness. But I clicked on the hidden settings revealing the archive of deleted versions. A long list of raw document files populated the screen. I opened the first PDF dated 2 weeks after David passed away. It was a standard update letter addressed to a major corporate sponsor thanking them for their continued commitment to the summer reading initiative. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page to read the sign-off. My stomach dropped. There, resting above the formal printed titles, were 2 signatures. The first was Caroline's neat, elegant cursive signing her name above the title co-founder. The second signature resting right next to hers belonged to my dead husband. I stared at the glowing screen and the chilling reality sinking into my bones. She was not just sending letters on Foundation stationery. She was actively forging his signature to make it appear as though they were equal partners finalizing documents together before he died. I leaned closer to the monitor, inspecting the ink strokes. A cold, cynical smile touched my lips. My sister was a terrible forger. David was left-handed. He always dragged his pen across the paper, leaving the bottom curve of the letter D flat and slightly smudged. His signature was a messy, energetic scrawl of a man whose brain worked faster than his hands. The signature on the screen featured perfect upward loops with pristine, even pressure on every single letter. Caroline was right-handed. She had taken an old document, traced his signature with a digital stylus, and copied the graphic onto the new letters. It was a flawless, sterile replica that lacked the specific ergonomic flaws of my husband's actual handwriting. She had used this forged graphic on dozens of letters. I clicked through file after file. Grant renewals, venue contracts, catering agreements for the upcoming memorial gala. Caroline was systematically rewriting the foundational documents, inserting herself into the history of the charity side by side with David. But vanity was not her only motive. The deeper I dug into the recovered files, the darker the digital trail became. I found a secondary folder buried under 3 layers of encrypted subdirectories. The folder was titled State Compliance. I double-clicked the icon and opened the most recent document sent out just 4 days ago. It was an official memorandum directed to the South Carolina State Education Board, the government entity that provided our matching grants. I began to read the text. The words on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. The letter formally notified the state board that Kathleen Thompson was stepping away from all operational duties due to a severe medical leave of absence. The text went on to describe my mental state as fragile and unfit for fiduciary responsibility. It concluded by declaring that Caroline Prescott was now the sole authorized point of contact, holding exclusive administrative control over the Foundation state funding allocations. Below that paragraph sat the forged signature of my husband, retroactively dated to a week before his death, supposedly verifying this transition of power. I sat back in the leather chair, the silence of the office pressing against my ears. This was no longer a dispute over a gala seating chart or stolen mail. This was a calculated federal crime. Caroline was submitting forged documents to a state government agency. She was legally binding the foundation to her own authority under the guise of executing my husband's dying wishes. She was weaponizing my grief, turning my quiet mourning period into a fabricated medical crisis to strip me of my legal standing. Bennett was using the donor list to grease the wheels of his real estate empire, while Caroline was securing the legal authority to write the checks. They were executing a hostile takeover of a nonprofit organization, and they were doing it right under my nose. My hands flew across the keyboard. I did not just read the files. I downloaded everything. I pulled the metadata, the timestamps, the IP addresses showing that the forged signatures were applied from a computer located in Mount Pleasant. I traced the digital pathways, proving my sister engineered the fraud weeks after she offered to help me with the memorial arrangements. I connected a secure thumb drive to the computer port and transferred every damning piece of evidence. I printed hard copies of the state education board letter, the forged donor updates, and the altered venue contracts. The printer whirred and clicked, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. I gathered the warm sheets of paper, stacking them into a neat, impenetrable file. My sister wanted to play dirty, using the polite whispers of Southern society to paint me as a broken, unstable widow. I was going to use the cold, hard truth of archival evidence to tear her narrative to shreds. I picked up my phone and opened my contact list. Caroline had threatened to call the board of directors if I caused a scene about the mail. She thought the board belonged to her. She assumed her expensive luncheons and Bennett's business connections bought their unwavering loyalty. I decided to call her bluff. I drafted a formal email to every single member of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project Board of Directors. I requested an emergency closed-door meeting for the following morning. I did not specify the agenda. I simply stated that an urgent matter regarding the legal integrity of the foundation required immediate attention. I hit send. I placed the thumb drive and the printed documents into a leather briefcase. The fear and the suffocating sorrow that had paralyzed me all summer evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant focus. I walked out of the home office, leaving the faint scent of sandalwood hanging in the air. I was ready to face the board of directors. I was ready to lay the evidence on the mahogany table and watch my sister squirm under the weight of her own federal fraud. What I did not realize as I locked my front door was that Caroline was already 10 steps ahead of me. I thought I was walking into a boardroom to expose a thief. I had no idea I was walking straight into a meticulously designed execution of my own character. The boardroom of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project occupied the top floor of a restored downtown historic building. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, you could see the gray waters of the Charleston Harbor. The view usually brought me a deep sense of calm. Today, the choppy water just looked cold and unforgiving. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. My leather briefcase rested on my lap. The brass latches felt cool against my damp palms. I arrived 30 minutes early to set up the projector and distribute the printed evidence folders at each of the 8 leather chairs. I wanted the proof waiting for them before they even took their seats. I needed the ink on the paper to speak louder than my sister ever could. Promptly at 9 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. The board of directors filed into the room, bringing the scent of expensive roasted coffee and high-end cologne. Alan Caldwell walked in first. He owned the largest commercial contracting firm in the state. Behind him was Diane Wallace, a key player on the regional zoning committee. Next came 2 local investment executives and a retired judge. They were the architects of local high society. They were also the exact people Bennett bragged about manipulating at his Sunday dinner. Caroline entered last. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and a subtle string of pearls. She projected an aura of quiet, tasteful mourning. She took the seat directly across from me, resting her designer handbag on the polished wood. Her eyes flicked down to the printed folder waiting at her place setting. She did not open it. She just offered me a tight, pitying smile. I stood up. The soft murmur of polite conversation died down. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I began, keeping my voice steady and professional. I called this emergency meeting because I uncovered a severe breach of legal protocol regarding the foundation. If you open the folders in front of you, we can review the documents together. A few board members hesitantly flipped open the manila covers. Alan Caldwell kept his hands steepled under his chin, ignoring the file entirely. On page 1, I continued tapping the surface of the table. You will find a memorandum sent to the South Carolina State Education Board 4 days ago. The letter states that I am taking a medical leave of absence and transferring all operational authority to Caroline. It features my late husband, signature verifying this transition. I paused, letting the weight of the statement settle into the quiet room. David was left-handed, I said. He dragged his pen. His signature was always flat on the bottom curve of the letter D. The signature on this government document features perfect upward loops with pristine, even pressure. It is a digital replica traced by a right-handed person. If you turn to page 3, you will see the metadata I extracted from the cloud server. The IP address proves this forged document was created and transmitted from my sister residential estate in Mount Pleasant weeks after David passed away. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire. I expected gasps. I expected the retired judge to demand an explanation. I expected Diane Wallace to look at Caroline with pure disgust. Instead, nobody moved. Diane leafed through the pages with the casual disinterest of someone reading a restaurant menu. Alan Caldwell adjusted his gold watch, his face an unreadable mask of wealthy indifference. Caroline did not panic. She did not flush red with guilt or stammer out a defense. She slowly unclasped her handbag and reached inside. She pulled out a white linen handkerchief monogrammed with a delicate cursive letter P. She pressed the cloth to the corner of her eye, letting out a shaky breath that sounded remarkably like a suppressed sob. "I did not want to have to do this here," Caroline whispered. Her voice trembled, hitting the exact frequency of a heartbroken sibling. "I tried to handle this privately. I really did." She looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with each board member. "Katie is very unwell. She continued, dabbing her dry eyes. "The grief has taken a terrible toll on her mind. She is spending her nights digging through computer codes and inventing these wild conspiracy theories." "That is metadata," I interrupted, my voice rising an octave. "It is digital proof of federal fraud, Caroline." "Katie, please," Alan Caldwell sighed. His voice was thick with southern condescension. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany table. "Do not yell at your sister. She has been working around the clock to keep the lights on here while you recover." I stared at Alan. He still had not opened the folder. Then my eyes drifted to Diane Wallace. She was looking at Caroline with deep, sympathetic understanding. A chilling realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Alan Caldwell owned a commercial contracting firm. Just yesterday, Bennett boasted about securing the permits to break ground on a new coastal resort. Alan was the contractor for that exact project. Diane Wallace was the zoning commissioner who approved the permits. This was not a board of directors providing oversight for a youth charity. This was a room full of Bennett business associates. They were bound to him by commercial leases, real estate contracts, and future political favors. They did not care about the forged signature. They did not care about the fraud. They only cared about protecting their own financial interests, and Bennett was the man holding their leashes. Caroline was simply his proxy, sitting at the table to ensure the charity donor list remained accessible for their networking deals. "David asked me to step in," Caroline said, her voice carrying a tone of pious sacrifice. "He knew his heart was failing. He knew Katie would not be able to handle the administrative stress. I signed those state updates on his behalf because we ran out of time. I did it to protect the funding. I did it to protect her." "She is lying," I said, gripping the edge of the table. "You are looking at a forged document sent to a state agency. If you ignore this, you are complicit." "That is quite enough," Alan Caldwell snapped, sitting up straight. His polite facade dropped, revealing a ruthless corporate enforcer. "Kathleen, we have all been very patient with your grieving process, but we will not sit here and listen to you threaten the board or slander the woman keeping this foundation afloat." He looked around the table, offering a subtle nod to the other members. A silent command passed between them. "Given the current circumstances," Alan continued, "I would like to propose a formal resolution. It is clear Kathleen requires dedicated time away from the office to address her health. I motion that we temporarily install Caroline Prescott as the acting director of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project, effective immediately." "I second the motion," Diane Wallace said without missing a beat. "You cannot do this," I said, the panic finally bleeding into my voice. "This is my husband's legacy." "All in favor?" Alan asked, ignoring me entirely. Every single hand at the table went up. "The vote is unanimous," Alan declared. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Kathleen, we will ensure your medical leave is handled with the utmost discretion. Please take the time you need to heal. Caroline will manage the operations from here." The meeting was over in less than 10 minutes. The board members filed out of the glass doors, murmuring quietly among themselves, avoiding my gaze. They left their printed evidence folders sitting on the table untouched. The proof of my sister's crimes was right in front of them, and they chose to look the other way because greed was a much stronger motivator than justice. I sat frozen in my chair. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, leaving me alone in the room with Caroline. She did not rush to leave. She carefully folded her monogrammed handkerchief and slipped it back into her designer bag. The tearful, vulnerable sister vanished. The cold, calculating socialite returned. She stood up and walked slowly around the long mahogany table until she stood right beside my chair. The scent of her floral perfume hung in the sterile, air-conditioned room. She leaned down, placing her hands on the leather backrest of my seat. Her lips hovered inches from my ear. "You really thought a stack of printed computer codes was going to save you?" She whispered, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. "You are so naive, Katie. You do not own anything in this town. You do not own this board. You do not own David Legacy. You do not even own your own grief anymore." She straightened up, smoothing the lapel of her blazer. "Pack up your little briefcase and go home," she commanded. "Do not come back to this office." She turned and walked out, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the hardwood floor. I sat alone in the boardroom, the silence ringing in my ears. They had stolen my title. They had orchestrated a flawless corporate coup, insulating themselves with political favors and real estate blackmail. My sister had successfully erased my standing in the very foundation I helped build. But as the initial shock began to fade, a new thought pierced through the fog of defeat. The board of directors controlled the titles. They controlled the public narrative. But I was still the primary signatory on the foundation operational bank accounts. The state matching funds and the corporate sponsor checks were deposited directly into a local branch under my exclusive banking credentials. The rural teachers relied on those accounts for their grant disbursements. Caroline might have the fancy title and the corner office, but a nonprofit director was powerless without access to the actual money. I needed to act fast before she figured out how to bypass the financial firewalls. I snapped my briefcase shut. I was heading straight to the bank to lock down every single dime. I assumed my banking credentials were my final line of defense. I had no idea the financial slaughter had already begun. The heavy mahogany doors of the executive chamber slammed shut with a definitive thud that echoed through the cavernous space. Victoria stood at the head of the polished table. The digital projector cast a harsh white glow across her face. She looked directly at her father. Richard sat comfortably in his leather chair. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that armored a lifetime of corporate ruthlessness. The tension in the room was a physical weight pressing down on the 12 directors. They shifted nervously under Victoria's uncompromising gaze. She pressed a button on her remote control. The screen flashed to a complex flowchart detailing massive financial discrepancies. These were the exact overseas deposits Richard had used to siphon enterprise funds for the past decade. Victoria spoke with a measured cadence. Her voice was steady and loud enough to command absolute attention. She explained how the shell corporations in the Cayman Islands were directly linked to Richard's personal trust. The executives exchanged terrified glances. They knew the implications of this revelation. The Securities and Exchange Commission would dismantle the entire firm if these documents were authenticated. Richard did not flinch. He leaned forward and steepled his fingers. A patronizing smile crept across his weathered face. He had built this logistics empire from a single rundown warehouse in Brooklyn. He spent 30 years crushing competitors and breaking unions. He was not a man who surrendered to presentation slides. He reminded the gathered officials of his legacy. He spoke of the blood and sweat poured into the foundation of their shared wealth. Richard painted Victoria as an ungrateful child throwing a tantrum. He claimed her evidence was fabricated by desperate rivals attempting a hostile takeover. Victoria felt a familiar sting of betrayal. She remembered being 10 years old. She had watched her mother pack her bags after Richard legally maneuvered her out of her own inheritance. Her mother had warned her that Richard viewed family merely as expendable assets. Victoria pushed the painful memory aside. She needed to remain completely objective. She countered his accusations with precise dates and transaction numbers. She demanded a formal vote to remove Richard as chief executive officer immediately. Before the chairman could call the motion to order, the side door swung open. Marcus strode into the gathering carrying a stack of manila folders. Victoria let out a breath of relief. Marcus was the chief financial officer. He was also her trusted confidant. They had spent 6 months secretly compiling this audit. He was supposed to deliver the final killing blow by providing the bank transfer receipts. Marcus walked around the perimeter. He did not look at Victoria. Instead of placing the receipts on the projector, he handed a folder to each person present. Victoria frowned. She asked Marcus what he was doing. Marcus finally turned to face her. His expression was completely blank. He announced to the committee that he had indeed found proof of massive fraud. However, the perpetrator was not Richard. Marcus pointed directly at Victoria. He stated that the foreign ledgers were registered under a dummy corporation managed by Victoria herself. The environment erupted into chaos. Several shareholders began shouting simultaneously. Victoria stared at Marcus in absolute shock. The man she had trusted with her career and her freedom had completely fabricated a counter-narrative. She realized instantly what had happened. Richard had gotten to him. Richard always found a person's price. Marcus had grown up in crippling poverty on the south side of Chicago. He had spent his entire life clawing his way into the elite economic circles of Manhattan. He was terrified of losing his newfound status. Richard must have offered him a guaranteed position as the next leader in exchange for framing Victoria. The distributed folders contained forged electronic correspondence. They showed Victoria supposedly instructing the accounting department to falsify quarterly earnings. The forgeries were incredibly sophisticated. They used her exact phrasing and digital signature. The presiding officer slammed his gavel on the desk, demanding order. He looked at Victoria with pure disgust. He declared that she would be escorted from the building immediately and handed over to local authorities. Security guards materialized inside the chamber. They moved toward Victoria with their hands resting on their utility belts. Victoria felt her heart pounding aggressively against her ribs. She took a deep breath. She refused to let panic override her logic. She knew that in corporate warfare you always need a contingency plan. She reached into the pocket of her blazer. She pulled out a small black flash drive. She held it up high so everyone could see the device. She commanded the guards to stop. She warned them that touching her would make them accessories to federal obstruction of justice. The sheer authority in her tone made the guards hesitate. Victoria walked over to the main console. She plugged the memory stick into the port. A new audio file appeared on the monitor. She pressed play. The space filled with the crisp sound of a recorded telephone conversation. The voices belonged to Richard and a notorious district judge. The recording clearly captured Richard offering the magistrate a $2 million bribe to dismiss an upcoming antitrust lawsuit against the conglomerate. The directors went perfectly silent. The color drained completely from Richard's face. His arrogant facade crumbled into genuine terror. This was not a dispute over internal budgets anymore. This was a severe felony offense. Victoria explained how she had obtained the interception. She had spent her teenage years learning advanced cryptography from her eccentric uncle. Her relative was a brilliant software engineer who had been blacklisted by the tech industry for exposing data privacy violations. He had taught Victoria how to trace encrypted communications. She had monitored Richard's private server for months, waiting for him to make a fatal mistake. The bribery documentation was the ultimate leverage. Marcus tried to speak, but his vocal cords cracked. He realized he had just allied himself with a criminal who was about to go to prison. The forged messages framing Victoria were suddenly entirely irrelevant. The chairman stood up violently. His chair crashed backward onto the expensive carpet. He demanded to know if the tape was authentic. Victoria nodded slowly. She stated that she had already transmitted the original format to the Department of Justice 30 minutes ago. She looked at Richard. She told him that his reign was officially over. She demanded that both Richard and Marcus resign their positions and surrender all their equity back to the Treasury. If they refused, she would release a secondary folder containing proof of their illegal campaign contributions. The silence in the room was absolute. Richard stared at the polished mahogany wood. He looked older and suddenly very frail. He realized he was completely trapped. American commercial law was utterly unforgiving when concrete verification of judicial corruption surfaced. The investors would face massive, catastrophic losses if they tried to protect him. The chairman cleared his throat. He prepared to formally strip Richard of his titles. The battle seemed decisively won. Victoria felt a tremendous rush of vindication. She had finally avenged her mother and secured her rightful place at the head of the organization. Suddenly, the heavy wooden doors burst open again. A squad of armed government operatives flooded into the meeting space. They wore dark tactical vests with bold yellow lettering. Detective Hayes walked in behind them. He was a tall, imposing man with a reputation for dismantling white-collar crime syndicates. Victoria smiled confidently. She stepped forward to greet the investigator. She thanked him for arriving so promptly. She extended her hand and offered to provide the original hard drives containing the bribery evidence against Richard. Detective Hayes did not take her hand. He looked at her with a completely unreadable expression. He reached inside his jacket and produced a thick stack of folded legal documents. Hayes announced that he had an official warrant. He stated that the Federal Bureau of Investigation was seizing control of the entire headquarters immediately. Victoria nodded in agreement. She assumed they were taking Richard into custody. She turned to watch her father face his downfall. But Hayes walked right past Richard. He walked past Marcus. He marched directly toward the chairman of the board. The presiding officer was a highly respected septuagenarian philanthropist who had supposedly served as the moral compass of the business for 20 years. Hayes slammed the paperwork onto the table in front of the chairman. He loudly declared that the older man was under arrest for orchestrating a massive international money laundering ring tied to a violent drug cartel. Victoria froze. Her entire understanding of the situation shattered in an instant. The bribery recording, the overseas deposits, the forged correspondence. They were all completely insignificant compared to cartel money laundering. She realized with horrifying clarity that Richard had not been stealing from the enterprise at all. Richard had been using the offshore routes to secretly pay off the criminal syndicate because the chairman had mortgaged the entire operation to them a decade ago. Richard had been bribing the magistrate to stall the antitrust lawsuit to prevent the government from looking too closely at their financial structure and discovering the cartel connection. Richard had been playing the role of the villain to protect the lives of everyone in the room. Victoria stared at her father. Richard looked back at her with eyes full of profound sorrow and desperate warning. He slowly shook his head side to side. He was silently begging her not to reveal the depth of her own access to the internal servers. If the federal agents discovered that Victoria had downloaded the master ledgers, the cartel would consider her a loose end. Detective Hayes turned his attention to the rest of the committee. He announced that no one was allowed to leave the building. He stated that everyone present was now considered a prime suspect in a federal racketeering conspiracy. The doors were locked from the outside. Victoria realized she was now trapped in a chamber with government operatives, a panicked traitor, a disgraced father, and the shadow of a lethal syndicate closing in on all of them. The exhaust from the flatbed tow truck tasted like bitter metal in the humid morning air. I stood on my front porch watching David's vintage green Ford roll down the street and disappear around the corner of our quiet neighborhood. A private automotive collector from Savannah had arrived at dawn. He took one look at the immaculate engine my husband spent 3 years restoring and handed me a heavy canvas bank envelope without a single negotiation. Inside that envelope sat $45,000 in crisp, untraceable cash. Just 2 days ago, Bennett cornered me in his pristine marble kitchen and offered me a pathetic $2,000 to take the truck off my hands. He thought I was a desperate, grieving widow who did not know the true value of her own property. He was wrong. That truck was a piece of my heart, but right now I did not need sentiment. I needed a war chest. Yesterday, Caroline used her newly minted title as acting director to freeze my banking access. The local branch manager looked at me with deep, patronizing pity as he explained that the board resolution legally revoked my signature authority. I spent the entire afternoon fielding frantic phone calls from rural school teachers whose summer reading program checks had suddenly bounced. My sister was starving underprivileged children just to tighten her grip on the organization. I knew I could not go to the local police. Bennett played golf with the police chief every other Sunday. The local authorities would treat this as a civil family dispute and brush it under the rug. I needed someone who operated far outside their wealthy coastal bubble. I got into my car and drove 20 miles inland, leaving the cobblestone streets and historic mansions of downtown Charleston behind. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a roadside diner called the Rusty Spoon. The neon sign above the door flickered, buzzing like an angry hornet in the midday heat. The air inside smelled of stale black coffee, scorched bacon grease, and floor bleach. It was the exact kind of place Caroline and Bennett would rather die than step foot inside. That made it the safest meeting spot in the state. I slid into a faded red vinyl booth in the far back corner. Sitting across from me was Elias Vance. Elias was a former federal tax auditor who left the government to start his own private forensic accounting firm. He possessed the sharp, cynical demeanor of a man who spent decades watching wealthy people lie about their money. He did not care about Southern hospitality or country club politics. He only cared about math. I reached into my purse and slid a banded stack of $100 bills across the sticky Formica table. $5,000 for the retainer. Elias swept the cash into his weathered leather satchel without even counting it. He pulled out a thick manila folder and dropped it in front of me. The thud sounded heavy, like a judge striking a gavel. Your sister and brother-in-law are not just playing dress-up with your husband's charity, Elias said, stirring his black coffee with a plastic spoon. They are treating it like a personal slush fund. I opened the folder. The first page was a highlighted bank statement from the primary operational account. Elias pointed a coffee-stained fingernail at a line item labeled as a fundraising venue fee for $5,000. I called the vendor, Elias explained, leaning forward. That money did not reserve a ballroom for a charity event. It paid the annual membership dues for Caroline and Bennett at the Oak Point Country Club. My stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. The money meant to buy textbooks for failing school districts was paying for my sister to drink overpriced champagne by a private pool. I turned the page. The next section detailed a string of charges categorized as administrative travel. The dates matched perfectly with the week Caroline posted photos of her luxury ski vacation in Aspen, Colorado. She used the foundation debit card to purchase first-class plane tickets and a suite at a 5-star mountain resort. She claimed on the ledger that she was scouting out-of-state donor networks. There was zero record of any meetings. There were only receipts for ski lift passes, luxury dining, and hot stone massages. Elias lowered his voice, the ambient diner noise masking our conversation. Your sister is stealing the petty cash, but your brother-in-law is setting up the real heist. He flipped to the back of the folder, revealing a complex web of limited liability companies. Bennett owns a consulting firm registered under a dummy name in Delaware, Elias said, tapping a printed spreadsheet. Last week, Caroline authorized a recurring monthly payment of $12,000 to this firm for structural assessment services. Your literacy project does not build structures, Kathleen. You distribute books. Bennett is wiring federal grant money directly into his own pocket through fake invoices. The anger inside me burned so hot it felt like ice in my veins. They were not just stealing credit for David's hard work. They were committing blatant federal wire fraud and embezzlement. I thought about David coming home with paint in his hair after spending his entire weekend renovating a rundown community center for the kids. He gave his life to this cause. Caroline and Bennett were bleeding the life out of his dream to fund their luxurious facade. If a federal audit ever hit the foundation, they would likely try to frame me since my name was originally on the accounts. What is our next move? I asked, looking up from the damning paperwork. Elias looked at me with a grim expression. We have the proof, but we lack the jurisdictional authority to spring the trap. If we hand this to local authorities, Bennett will use his political leverage to bury the evidence and tie you up in endless civil litigation. You need a shark. You need a high wealth estate lawyer who hates your brother in law more than he loves money. You need to file a blind injunction with the state attorney general before they know what hit them. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and slid the device across the table. But you have a secondary problem, Kathleen, he warned. I monitor local financial blogs to keep tabs on corporate shifts. Look at what was posted an hour ago. I stared at the bright screen. It was a digital newsletter popular among the Charleston elite and major philanthropic sponsors. There was a blind item article describing the erratic behavior of a prominent local widow who was reportedly hoarding charity assets and struggling with severe substance abuse. The article praised the widow's sister for stepping in to save the foundation from financial ruin out of her own pocket. Caroline was launching a preemptive strike. She knew that if I ever tried to speak out, no one would believe a hysterical addict. She was poisoning the well, ensuring the wealthy donors viewed her as the savior and me as a liability. The insidious nature of Southern gossip meant these rumors would spread like ivy, choking the truth before it ever saw the light of day. If I defended myself wildly, I proved her point. If I stayed quiet, the foundation would lose its primary corporate sponsor by the end of the week. The clock was ticking faster than I anticipated. I needed to secure a ruthless attorney today, and I needed a public stage big enough to expose my sister where her lies could not protect her. The drive back from the roadside diner felt like navigating a bad dream. The blinding midday sun glared off the hood of my car, baking the coastal highway. My mind raced, categorizing the financial documents Elias had just handed me. I had the proof of the embezzlement, but the blind item blog post burned in my thoughts. Southern society operates on a very specific frequency. People do not shout their accusations in public squares. They whisper them over iced tea and finger sandwiches until the lies become accepted gospel. Caroline was weaponizing that exact cultural machinery against me. She knew that if she painted me as a fragile addict hoarding charity money, nobody would look twice at her own luxury expenditures. I needed to stop in the local grocery store on my way home. The refrigerator was bare and I needed coffee to fuel the long night ahead. I pulled into the parking lot of the high-end market on King Street. The automatic doors slid open, blasting me with frigid air conditioning. The store smelled of fresh-baked artisanal bread and imported cheeses. It was the epicenter of local domestic life, where the wealthy wives of Charleston gathered to inspect organic produce and exchange daily gossip. I grabbed a metal shopping cart and pushed it toward the dairy aisle. I kept my head down, focusing on the simple task of buying cream. As I turned the corner, my cart nearly bumped into another shopper. I looked up and saw Abigail Henderson. Abigail was a prominent local philanthropist. Just last spring, she hosted a lavish garden party at her historic estate to help David raise funds for a new mobile library. She had stood in my kitchen drinking wine and telling me how much she admired our dedication to the community. Abigail froze. Her hand tightened around a carton of almond milk. Her eyes darted from my face down to my hands and back up again. "Hello, Abigail," I said, forcing a warm, polite smile. "It is good to see you." She did not smile back. Her face flushed a deep, mottled pink. Without saying a single word, she dropped the carton of milk back into the refrigerated display case. She grabbed the handle of her cart, spun it around so fast the wheels squealed against the polished floor, and power walked in the opposite direction. She abandoned her entire grocery run just to avoid speaking to me. I stood in the cold aisle, the polite smile slowly dying on my face. A few feet away, two women standing near the artisan cheeses stopped their conversation. They turned their heads, watching the scene unfold. One woman leaned into the other, raising a manicured hand to shield her mouth as she whispered something. The second woman nodded her eyes, scanning me with a mixture of pity and revulsion. The smear campaign was not just a digital rumor anymore. It had successfully infected the real world. Caroline had likely spent her entire morning calling her country club friends, expressing fake concern over my supposed downward spiral. She probably told them I was erratic, unstable, and dangerous. In the polite circles of this city, ignoring someone was the ultimate form of social execution. My sister was isolating me, cutting off my allies before I even knew I was at war. I abandoned my cart right there in the dairy aisle. I walked out of the store, the automatic doors sliding shut behind me. The heavy, humid air outside felt suffocating, but I welcomed it over the freezing judgment of the grocery store. I drove home in silence. I locked the front door and walked into David's home office. The house felt like a fortress under siege. I placed the forensic accounting folder on the mahogany desk. I had the ledgers showing Bennett stealing federal grant money. I had the forged signatures. But Elias was right. I could not fight a public relations war from inside an empty house. I needed a shark to help me file a blind injunction, and I needed a stage. Before I could strategize my next move, my cell phone began to vibrate on the desk. The caller identification displayed a name that made my pulse spike. Theodore Sinclair. Theodore Sinclair was the chief executive officer of Sinclair Industries. His company was the primary corporate sponsor for the Low Country Youth Literacy Project. Their annual matching grant provided nearly half of our operating budget. If Sinclair pulled his funding, the rural after-school programs would collapse within a month. I took a deep breath, steadying my nerves. I swiped the screen and answered the call. "Mr. Sinclair," I said, keeping my tone even and professional. "Thank you for reaching out." "Kathleen?" His voice came through the speaker, deep and resonant. It carried the gravelly weight of a man who spent his life making difficult corporate decisions. "I will skip the pleasantries. I read the local philanthropic blog this morning. I also received a very troubling phone call from your sister Caroline 2 hours ago." My grip on the phone tightened. Caroline was moving faster than I anticipated. She was not just poisoning the local gossip pool, she was directly targeting our financial backbone. "I can explain the situation." I started preparing to defend myself against the accusations of substance abuse and hoarding. He cut me off. "Your sister told me you are suffering from a severe psychological break. She claimed you locked her out of the operating accounts and are refusing to disperse funds to the rural schools." She then offered to personally backstop the upcoming grant cycle out of her own pocket, just to ensure the children do not suffer for your supposed mistakes. The sheer audacity of her lie left me briefly speechless. She used the board resolution to freeze my banking access, and now she was spinning that freeze to blame me. By offering to pay out of pocket, she was cementing her status as the heroic savior while framing me as the villain. "Mr. Sinclair, I promise you the narrative my sister is pushing is entirely fabricated," I said. My voice remained remarkably calm despite the anger burning in my chest. "I have physical evidence proving she and her husband are misappropriating foundation resources." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I braced myself for the rejection. I expected him to politely withdraw his corporate sponsorship, citing a morality clause in our contract. "I know, Kathleen," he said quietly. I blinked, staring at the dark mahogany wood of the desk. "Excuse me?" I asked. "I know your sister is lying," Sinclair repeated. "I have known something was wrong for a while. David came to my office 3 weeks before he passed away." The room seemed to tilt. "David went to our biggest sponsor. He never told me about that meeting." "Your husband was a brilliant advocate for those kids," Sinclair continued. "But he was too trusting. He told me Bennett was pressuring him for access to the donor registries. David suspected Bennett was using the foundation letterhead to secure zoning permits for his real estate ventures. He did not have the hard proof yet, but he was terrified they would try to hijack the charity if his health failed. He asked me to watch the accounts carefully." Tears pricked the corners of my eyes. Even as his heart was giving out, David was trying to protect our life work. He was trying to protect me. When Caroline called me today, spinning that ridiculous story about your mental decline, I knew David was right, Sinclair said. His tone shifted from quiet reflection to cold corporate strategy. "I want to help you crush them, Kathleen. Nobody uses my charitable donations as a slush fund." I let out a shaky breath, feeling a tremendous weight lift off my shoulders. "I am meeting with a forensic accountant," I told him. "We have the proof. Bennett is routing federal grant money into a dummy corporation. Caroline is stealing the petty cash for luxury vacations. But My accountant warned me that Bennett will use his local political connections to bury the evidence if we just go to the police. Elias is a smart man, Sinclair noted, recognizing the accountant name. He is right. You cannot fight them in a quiet courtroom. They own too many favors in this town. You need to trap them in public where their political friends cannot intervene without ruining their own reputations. I looked at the printed venue contract sitting in the evidence folder. The upcoming memorial gala. Caroline had hijacked the planning, changing the flowers and forging her name onto the programs. She was desperate to use that event to coronate herself as the new queen of the Charleston philanthropic scene. She invited the governor. She invited the regional zoning commissioners. She invited every wealthy socialite in the state. The memorial gala, I said, the plan forming instantly in my mind. It is happening in 5 days. Caroline wants the spotlight. I am going to give it to her. Sinclair chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. You are going to need a ruthless attorney to draft the injunctions. Someone who operates outside the country club circle. I know exactly what I need to do, I replied. I ended the call. The isolation I felt in the grocery store vanished. Caroline thought she was playing a brilliant game of chess, isolating the weak widow. She had no idea she had just cornered someone who was finally ready to burn the entire board to the ground. I grabbed my car keys and the heavy evidence folder. It was time to find the shark. The Battery in downtown Charleston is a world away from the flashy new wealth of Mount Pleasant. Here the streets are paved with uneven cobblestones, and the air smells of salty pluff mud mixed with ancient blooming magnolias. This is where the old money resides. The families behind these wrought iron gates do not brag about their bank accounts at Sunday dinners. They own the banks. I parked my car under the shade of a sprawling live oak tree and walked toward a towering 3-story historic home featuring double piazzas and perfectly preserved gas lanterns. This was the private residence and legal office of Charles Montgomery. Charles was an estate attorney whose lineage in South Carolina predated the Civil War. He did not advertise his services on billboards or television screens. If you needed his specific brand of ruthless legal maneuvering, you had to be referred by someone he respected. Theodore Sinclair had made the introductory phone call for me less than an hour ago. I walked up the wide brick steps and knocked on the heavy mahogany door. An assistant wearing a crisp polo shirt ushered me straight through the grand foyer and out onto the back veranda. The veranda was a masterpiece of Southern comfort. Wicker chairs with thick navy cushions sat arranged around a low teak table. Ceiling fans whirred overhead, cutting through the stifling afternoon humidity. Charles Montgomery stood near the railing looking out over his meticulously manicured garden. He wore a seersucker's suit that would look ridiculous on a younger man, but on him it looked like a uniform of quiet, undeniable power. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his posture was rigid, upright, and alert. "Kathleen," he said, turning to face me. His voice carried a slow, genteel drawl that masked a razor-sharp intellect. "Theodore Sinclair speaks very highly of your late husband. I am deeply sorry for your loss. Please have a seat." I sat down on the wicker sofa, placing the heavy leather briefcase on the teak table between us. Charles sat opposite me. He poured 2 glasses of sweet tea from a frosted crystal pitcher, sliding one across the table. The ice clinked softly against the glass. "I understand you are having a disagreement with your brother-in-law," Charles noted, taking a slow sip of his drink. I unlatched the briefcase. "It is not a disagreement, Mr. Montgomery. It is a hostile takeover." I pulled out the forensic accounting ledger compiled by Alias Vance and the forged state compliance documents I extracted from David's computer. I laid them side by side on the table. Bennett and Caroline are using the Low Country Youth Literacy Project to launder federal grant money. I explained, keeping my voice detached and factual. My sister forged my husband's signature on government documents to grant herself exclusive administrative authority. My brother-in-law is routing the funds into a dummy corporation registered in Delaware. Charles did not react with shock. Men in his position rarely did. He set his sweet tea down and pulled a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses from his breast pocket. He leaned forward, picking up the forensic ledger. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound on the veranda was the rustle of turning pages and the distant chirp of cicadas in the garden. I watched his eyes scan the spreadsheets, tracking the stolen money, tracing the false invoices. I waited for him to dismiss me, to tell me this was a family dispute suited for mediation. Instead, Charles placed the documents back on the table. He took off his glasses and folded them neatly. A slow, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Bennett is a parasite," Charles said, his southern drawl sharpening into a lethal edge. 3 years ago, he bought a pristine tract of coastal marshland near my family's hunting lodge. He bypassed environmental regulations, bribed the local zoning board, and bulldozed 100-year-old cypress trees to build cheap stucco condominiums. He represents everything rotting away in this state. He tapped his index finger against the forged compliance letter. I have been waiting for that arrogant fool to make a fatal mistake, stealing from a children's charity and forging a federal document to do it. That is a breathtaking level of stupidity. Can we stop them? I asked. Charles leaned back in his wicker chair. We are not just going to stop them, Kathleen. Let us ruin them. I felt a surge of adrenaline pulse through my veins. This was the shark Theodore Sinclair promised. The local police are useless here, Charles explained, interlocking his fingers, resting them on his lap. Bennett plays golf with the precinct captains. If we file a standard police report, the chief will tip him off. Bennett will immediately wire the stolen money to an offshore account, burn his hard drives, and claim his corporate identity was stolen by an unknown hacker. We cannot give him a single second to react. What is the alternative? I asked, leaning closer. We bypass the local jurisdiction entirely, Charles stated. Wire fraud crossing state lines via that Delaware dummy corporation elevates this to a federal offense. Embezzling state matching grants makes it a direct issue for the South Carolina Attorney General. I happen to play poker with the Deputy Director of the State Investigative Division. We will draft a blind injunction today. We will prepare an airtight legal brief containing this forensic evidence and hand-deliver it to the state authorities. He picked up his sweet tea, taking another slow, deliberate sip. By the time the ink dries, a judge will sign a warrant freezing every single personal and business asset tied to your sister and brother-in-law. When do we execute the strike? I asked. Charles looked at me, his eyes narrowing with tactical precision. When will they be surrounded by the very people they are trying to impress? When will they be unable to spin the narrative or use their wealth to shield themselves? The memorial gala, I said, the vision crystallizing in my mind. It is this Saturday night at the Oak Point Country Club. The governor is attending. The zoning commissioners Bennett bribes will be sitting at the head tables. Caroline is planning to stand on stage and accept an award on my husband's behalf. She wants to be the center of attention. Then we will make sure she gets exactly what she wants, Charles said, his smile widening. I will coordinate with the state investigators. They will walk through the ballroom doors right in the middle of her big moment. But to make this work, we need to lower their defenses. They cannot suspect you are fighting back. They need to believe they have already won. He pointed at my purse. You need to feed them a decoy. I pulled my cell phone from my bag. Caroline was monitoring the charity email accounts and likely tracking my personal correspondence. I opened a new draft addressing it to the director of a well-known inpatient grief retreat located deep in the Arizona desert. I typed out a desperate-sounding inquiry. I wrote that I was struggling to cope with my husband's death and felt unable to manage my daily responsibilities. I asked for immediate admission pricing for a 30-day stay starting this weekend. I made sure to mention that my sister was handling all my financial affairs and would be the point of contact for the billing department. I showed the screen to Charles. He read the text and gave a short, approving nod. Send it, he instructed. Caroline will intercept that email within the hour. She will show it to Bennett. They will relax, thinking you are fleeing the state and surrendering control of the foundation. They will walk into that gala on Saturday feeling untouchable. I pressed send. The decoy was in the digital ether. Charles gathered the forensic ledgers and the forged signatures, sliding them into a secure legal folder. I will start drafting the injunction immediately. My team will work through the night to formalize the brief for the Attorney General. You go home and prepare yourself for Saturday. I stood up, picking up my empty briefcase. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. "Do not thank me yet, Kathleen," he replied, walking me back through the grand hallway toward the front door. "The legal trap is set. The investigators will serve the warrants and freeze their accounts, but you know your sister better than anyone. When those agents walk into the ballroom, she will play the victim. She will cry. She will claim this is a misunderstanding. She will try to manipulate the crowd before the handcuffs even click." I stepped out onto the brick porch, the heavy afternoon heat washing over me again. "You are right," I said. Charles fixed me with a stern gaze. "The law will put them in prison, Kathleen, but if you want to destroy their social capital, you need something the law cannot provide. You need undeniable public proof. You need to silence her before the authorities even cross the room." I drove away from the historic battery, my mind racing as I navigated the coastal traffic. Charles had engineered the perfect legal strike. Bennett and Caroline would lose their real estate empire, their bank accounts, and their freedom. But the social execution required a different weapon. I needed to hijack the audiovisual presentation at the gala. Caroline was planning a slideshow of her fake philanthropy. If I could swap her flash drive, I could expose her lies to the entire room. But forensic accounting ledgers do not make for compelling viewing on a 20-foot projector screen. The wealthy donors would not understand the complex tax documents. I needed a narrative. I needed a voice everyone in that room trusted implicitly. I pulled into my driveway, the setting sun casting long shadows across the lawn. I looked up at the small circular window near the roofline of my house. The attic. David was a meticulous record keeper, not just with paperwork, but with his words. He kept a digital camera up there, logging his thoughts, recording site visits, and documenting the foundation's history. If he knew Bennett was corrupt before he died, maybe he left a warning. Maybe he left a final message. I unlocked my front door, bypassing the kitchen entirely. The legal trap was locked and loaded. Now I needed to find the matches to burn their kingdom down. I reached for the handle of the pull-down attic stairs. It was time to find out exactly what my husband captured on film during his final days. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight as I climbed into the attic. The space beneath the roof was a sweltering furnace. The South Carolina sun baked the asphalt shingles all afternoon, trapping the stifling heat inside the cramped storage area. Sweat beaded on my forehead before I even reached the top step. The air smelled of dry cedar and old cardboard. I navigated carefully across the wooden beams, avoiding the exposed fiberglass insulation. Tucked into the far corner behind a row of winter coats sat a heavy, black protective case. I grabbed the plastic handle and dragged it toward the pull-down staircase. The case contained David's digital single-lens reflex camera along with his specialized recording equipment. My husband never trusted his memory alone. He documented every milestone of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project. He recorded site visits, interviews with rural teachers, and brainstorming sessions. I carried the heavy case down into the air-conditioned relief of the home office. I set it on the mahogany desk and flipped the latches. Inside the foam padding rested the camera body, 2 lenses, and a clear plastic sleeve containing 6 memory cards. I booted up my laptop. I inserted the first memory card into the side port. A directory window populated the screen, showing dozens of video thumbnails. I double-clicked a random file from 3 years ago. The media player opened. Suddenly, David filled the screen. He wore a faded blue t-shirt speckled with white primer. He held a paint roller in his right hand, working on the drywall of our very first youth center. The person behind the camera asked him a question. David turned, looking directly into the lens. A smear of blue paint rested on his cheek. He let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed through my quiet house. The sound of his joy felt like a physical blow to my chest. My breath hitched. For a brief, agonizing second, it felt like he was right there in the room with me. The profound love we shared washed over me, drowning out the anger and the strategy. I pressed my hand against my mouth, stifling a sob. Seeing him so vibrant, so full of relentless optimism, reminded me exactly what I was fighting to protect. He built a sanctuary for children who had nothing. My sister was treating that sanctuary like a luxury ATM. I wiped my eyes, clearing my vision. I closed that video and ejected the first card. I needed a specific timeline. I needed the final weeks. I inserted the last memory card from the plastic sleeve. The files here were dated just a month before his heart failed. I scrolled past a few mundane recordings of budget meetings and office renovations. Near the bottom of the list, I spotted a file labeled simply with my name. My pulse quickened. I moved the cursor and clicked play. The screen shifted to a static shot. The framing was familiar. It was recorded right here in this exact home office. David sat in his leather chair. He did not look vibrant or joyful. His skin carried a pale grayish hue. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. He looked like a man who knew his time was running out. Katie, his recorded voice, began low and raspy. If you are watching this, it means my heart finally gave out. The doctors told me yesterday the medication is losing its effectiveness. I leaned closer to the monitor, my hands trembling, hovering over the keyboard. I need to put this on the record. David continued staring directly into the camera lens. You are the sole successor of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project. We built this foundation together, and you are the only person I trust to lead it. I have not filed the official succession paperwork yet because I do not want to alert the board until everything is secure. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His expression hardened, shifting from sorrow to stern warning. You cannot trust your sister Katie. You cannot trust Bennett. Last week, Bennett cornered me after a fundraiser. He pressured me to hand over our private donor registries. He wants to use our philanthropic network to secure commercial zoning permits for his coastal developments. When I refused, Caroline called me. She demanded a seat on the executive board. She said her social connections were the only reason we were successful. David let out a harsh, bitter sigh. They are circling like vultures. They think because my health is failing, they can orchestrate a quiet takeover. They want the prestige and they want the money. Do not let Caroline near the administrative accounts. Do not let Bennett anywhere near the board of directors. They will bleed this charity dry to fund their own vanity. I love you, Katie. Keep fighting for the kids. The screen went black. The video ended. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house pressing against my ears. A cold, lethal calm settled over my entire body. I did not just have a warning, I had a smoking gun. A dying declaration from the founder explicitly forbidding Caroline and Bennett from touching the organization. It was the ultimate, undeniable truth. If this video played in front of the wealthy donors, the state governor, and the regional zoning commissioners, my sister would lose her false narrative instantly. I opened a video editing software. I cropped the footage, removing the dead space at the beginning and the end. I enhanced the audio, ensuring every single syllable of David warning rang crystal clear. I exported the file and saved it onto a discreet black flash drive. Charles Montgomery set the legal trap. Now I possess the social detonator. But having the video was only half the battle. I needed to ensure it played at the memorial gala tomorrow night without Caroline realizing what was happening until it was too late. The Oak Point Country Club was a fortress of exclusivity. Caroline had likely hired private security for the event and instructed the staff to treat me like a fragile, unreliable guest. I could not just walk up to the podium and plug in my device. I needed an inside operative. Friday afternoon brought a brief torrential coastal rainstorm. I drove to the country club under a sky bruised with dark purple clouds. The parking lot was filled with catering vans and florist delivery trucks. The setup for the memorial gala was in full swing. I wore a simple baseball cap and a dark raincoat, keeping my head down as I walked through the service entrance. The kitchen corridors were a chaotic blur of shouting chefs and rolling utility carts. I bypassed the main ballroom doors and slipped into the narrow, carpeted stairwell leading up to the audiovisual control booth. The tech booth overlooked the entire Magnolia Room. Through the soundproof glass window, I could see the expansive ballroom below. Dozens of round tables were covered in crisp white linen. At the center of every single table sat a towering arrangement of pristine white roses. Caroline had gotten her sterile dentist waiting room flowers after all. I turned my attention to the glowing monitors inside the booth. Sitting in a rolling chair, chewing on a thumbnail, was Noah. Noah was the venue technical director. He was a 20-something audio engineer who wore a faded black crewneck sweater and an expression of perpetual misery. Working high society events in Charleston usually meant enduring verbal abuse from wealthy socialites who did not understand how wireless microphones worked. I knocked softly on the open door frame. Noah spun around looking annoyed. "The ballroom is closed for setup, Mom," he said, his voice monotone. I pulled off my baseball cap. "I know, Noah. I am Kathleen Thompson. The gala tomorrow is for my late husband." His annoyed expression shifted into awkward discomfort. "Oh, right. Sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thompson. Do you need a microphone check or something?" I stepped into the dim booth, closing the door behind me. "Actually, I need a favor." Noah crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair. "Look, if this is about the slideshow transition, your sister already yelled at me for 20 minutes this morning. She wants a very specific crossfade between the photos. She told me if the screen goes blank for even 1 second, she will have my job. She is kind of a nightmare to deal with." I smiled a genuine cold smile. "I know she is. That is exactly why I am here." I reached into my raincoat pocket. Earlier that morning, I withdrew a portion of the cash from the sale of David vintage truck. I pulled out a banded stack of $100 bills, 10 bills, $1,000. I placed the stack on the edge of the digital soundboard right next to Noah's keyboard. Noah stared at the money. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the cash to my face. "What is this for?" "My sister brought you a silver flash drive earlier this week," I said, pointing to the equipment rack. "It contains a slideshow she plans to play while she accepts an award on stage. I need you to swap her drive with mine." I pulled the discreet black flash drive from my other pocket and set it next to the cash. Noah picked up the black drive, weighing it in his palm. "Mrs. Thompson, I could get fired for sabotaging a presentation. The club manager does not mess around with these VIP events." "You will not get fired," I promised, keeping my voice steady and persuasive, "because tomorrow night this entire country club is going to become a federal crime scene. State investigators are going to walk through those doors and arrest my sister for wire fraud. When that happens, nobody is going to care about a slideshow transition." Noah raised his eyebrows, his jaw dropping slightly. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious," I replied. "Caroline hijacked my husband's charity. She is stealing grant money meant for poor kids. This drive contains the proof. I need it to play the second she steps up to the podium. And I need you to lock the control panel. When the video starts, she is going to panic. She will wave at you to cut the feed. You have to ignore her." Noah looked down at the $1,000 resting on his soundboard. He thought about the verbal abuse Caroline hurled at him that morning. He thought about the wealthy entitlement that infected his daily life at the club. A slow, mischievous grin spread across his face. He reached out and slid the cash into his pocket. "Consider it done, Mrs. Thompson," Noah said. "I will program a macro command into the main server. Once I trigger your file, it overrides the manual controls at the podium. She will not be able to pause it or mute the audio. The video will play all the way through, no matter what buttons she pushes on stage." "Thank you, Noah," I said, turning toward the door. I walked back down the narrow, carpeted stairs and slipped out through the kitchen service corridor. The coastal rainstorm had passed, leaving the air smelling of wet asphalt and ozone. The pieces were in place. Charles Montgomery had the legal brief. The state investigators had their timeline. Noah controlled the audiovisual system. The decoy email ensured Caroline and Bennett felt completely secure. Tomorrow night, the Charleston elite would gather in their finest clothes to drink champagne and celebrate a fabricated hero. They expected a night of polite Southern hospitality. Instead, they were going to witness a public execution. The Oak Point Country Club sparkled under the coastal night sky. Valets in crisp ivory uniforms sprinted across the circular driveway, opening doors for a parade of imported luxury sedans. The heavy August humidity clung to the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oak trees. But inside the Magnolia Room, the climate was artificially chilled to perfection. The scent of expensive roasted tenderloin and designer perfumes masked the underlying stench of corporate greed. This was the pinnacle of Charleston high society, a gathering designed to celebrate philanthropy while functioning as a high-stakes networking mixer for the wealthy elite. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan, taking a slow, steady breath. For 2 months, my wardrobe consisted exclusively of faded sweatpants and shapeless black morning attire. Society expected a widow to shrink to wrap herself in dark fabrics and cast her eyes downward. My family anticipated a fragile ghost. Tonight, I refused to play the phantom. I stepped out of the vehicle wearing a tailored emerald green silk gown. It was the exact dress David bought for me in Savannah 3 years ago. He always said the vibrant shade brought out a fierce light in my eyes. The silk draped flawlessly, reflecting the warm glow of the club exterior lighting. I paired it with his favorite gold pendant, letting the cold metal rest against my collarbone. I did not look broken. I looked like a woman preparing to claim her territory. Handing my keys to a stunned valet, I walked up the sweeping brick staircase. The heavy oak entrance doors stood wide open, welcoming the steady stream of influential guests. A string quartet played a delicate classical piece in the corner of the grand foyer, their music floating above the low hum of transactional conversations. I bypassed the coat check and glided straight toward the main ballroom. The double doors were pinned back, revealing the breathtaking scale of the event. A sea of round tables filled the floor, each draped in pristine linen and crowned with towering centerpieces of sterile white roses. The flowers looked manufactured, devoid of the vibrant life David loved, a perfect reflection of my sister hollow ambition. I scanned the crowded room, taking inventory of the players. The state governor stood near the mahogany bar, swirling a scotch, while nodding deeply at a prominent shipping magnate. Theodore Sinclair, the corporate sponsor who helped me set the legal trap, stood near a side pillar. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. He offered a nearly imperceptible nod before turning his attention back to his conversation. He knew the state investigators were staged outside waiting for the signal. The legal avalanche was primed, but the social execution required my direct participation. I had not taken 10 steps into the ballroom before Caroline materialized from the crowd. She wore a stunning midnight blue gown that swept the floor, her blonde hair pinned into an immaculate structural updo. Her face was an expertly painted canvas of fake warmth designed for the society photographers roaming the floor. But the moment her eyes locked onto my emerald dress, the facade cracked. A flash of pure, unfiltered panic rippled across her features. She expected the decoy email to work. She thought I was weeping in an Arizona desert retreat. My vibrant, undeniable presence shattered her illusion of total control. "Katie," she gasped, rushing forward to grip my forearm. Her manicured fingernails dug sharply into my skin. "What are you doing here? I thought you were checking into the facility out west." I offered a serene, chilling smile, gently prying her fingers off my arm. I realized running away would not honor my husband, Caroline. I need to be here to witness your big moment tonight. Her jaw clenched, the muscles ticking beneath her flawless makeup. She glanced around nervously, ensuring none of the major donors were watching our exchange. Her eyes darted toward the front of the room, calculating how much damage my presence could inflict on her carefully choreographed coronation. "Well, it is certainly brave of you to show up," Caroline hissed, dropping her voice to a venomous whisper. "But that dress is highly inappropriate. People are going to talk. You look like you are attending a cocktail party, not a memorial." I smoothed the silk fabric of my skirt. David loved this color. "I am dressing for him, not for your photographer. Now where am I sitting?" Caroline straightened her spine, slipping back into her role as the venue dictator. "The seating chart was finalized yesterday, Katie. Since we assumed you were leaving the state, your original seat was reallocated to a major corporate contributor. But do not worry, I found a cozy spot for you to rest." She hooked her arm through mine, exerting a surprising amount of physical force as she attempted to steer me away from the center of the ballroom. She guided me toward the far left wall, bypassing the glittering front rows, where the politicians and executives mingled. We navigated through the maze of white roses until we reached a small, cramped table shoved adjacent to the swinging metal kitchen doors. A line of waiters rushed past, carrying heavy trays of appetizers, creating a chaotic, noisy atmosphere. The table was tucked into a dark shadow, effectively erasing whoever sat there from the main view of the stage. "This is table 42, Caroline said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "It is quiet back here. You will not be overwhelmed by the crowd. The main VIP tables are strictly reserved for active board members and our highest tier donors. It is a matter of protocol, sweetheart." I stared at the dark, isolated corner. My sister was attempting to physically banish me from my own life work. She wanted me hidden near the dirty dishes while she stole the spotlight. I planted my heels firmly into the thick carpet, refusing to take another step toward the kitchen doors. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, and prepared to deploy the most devastating weapon in the Southern cultural arsenal: politeness delivered at a highly inappropriate volume. "Caroline." I projected my voice clearly over the hum of the crowd, ensuring my tone sounded bright and full of innocent confusion. "Are you suggesting the widow of the founder is not considered a VIP at her own husband memorial gala?" A nearby group of wealthy socialites stopped mid-sentence, turning their heads to observe the commotion. Caroline flushed a deep mottled pink, her eyes widening in horror. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, grabbing for my arm again. I stepped back, maintaining my cheerful, booming projection. "I just do not understand why the acting director would seat the creator of the charity next to the busboy station. Does the board of directors know you ran out of room for family at the front table? Perhaps I should go ask Alan Caldwell if he would mind giving up his chair for David Wife." More heads turned. A quiet hush began to ripple outward from our position, disrupting the ambient noise of the gala. In Charleston, creating a public scene is the ultimate social sin. Caroline had built her entire reputation on flawless etiquette and seamless hosting. She was currently standing in front of the local elite, caught trying to shove a grieving widow into a closet. The optics were catastrophic for her brand. Her chest heaved with suppressed rage, but she knew she was trapped. If she argued, she looked cruel. If she let me approach the board members, I might disrupt the delicate financial web Bennett had spun. She had to neutralize the spectacle immediately. "Of course not." Katie Caroline practically choked on the words, stretching her mouth into a painful, forced grin. "There was simply a mix-up with the place cards. Please follow me. We will make room at the front." "Thank you so much," I replied, lowering my volume to a civilized murmur. "You are always so accommodating." I followed my sister through the parted sea of curious guests, walking directly toward the epicenter of the room. The primary VIP table sat mere feet away from the polished wooden stage. As we approached, I saw Bennett sitting next to Diane Wallace, the regional zoning commissioner. He was leaning in, whispering something into her ear while swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. The moment Bennett spotted me in the vibrant emerald dress, his smug expression shattered. He sat up rigid, his eyes darting toward Caroline in silent, furious demand. Caroline ignored him, gesturing stiffly to an empty chair facing the projector screen. "Sit here," she commanded quietly. "Do not cause another disruption, or I will have security escort you out for your own mental well-being." I gracefully took my seat, smoothing the fabric over my knees. The proximity to the stage was flawless. I had a front-row view of the podium and an unobstructed sightline to the audiovisual booth perched high above the back wall. The overhead chandeliers began to dim, plunging the audience into a soft, dramatic twilight. A singular, bright spotlight pierced the darkness, illuminating the center of the wooden stage. The hum of conversation faded into expectant silence. The host, a prominent local news anchor hired for the evening, walked out from the wings carrying a microphone. The trap was set. The audience was captive. The moment of reckoning was finally here, and my sister was about to walk directly into the snare she built with her own two hands. The local news anchor, hired to MC the event, stepped onto the polished wooden stage. His silver hair gleamed under the theatrical lighting, and his tailored tuxedo spoke of a man accustomed to addressing the Charleston elite. He tapped the microphone twice. The sharp rhythmic thuds cut through the ambient chatter of the ballroom. Slowly, the wealthy donors, politicians, and socialites took their seats. The clinking of crystal wine glasses faded into a quiet, expectant hum. I sat in the front row, feeling the cool silk of my emerald dress against my skin. The stage lights cast a warm glow over the mahogany podium and the towering white floral arrangements flanking the stairs. The host cleared his throat, producing a resonant broadcast quality baritone that filled the cavernous room. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." He began, offering a practiced, somber smile. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a remarkable legacy. The Low Country Youth Literacy Project stands as a beacon of hope for our community. But before we discuss the future of this vital organization, we must pause to honor its foundation. I ask everyone in the room to please bow your heads for 60 seconds of silence in memory of our founder, David Thompson." The ballroom fell still. 200 influential figures lowered their heads in unison. The string quartet stopped playing. The silence was profound, pressing against my eardrums. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, honoring the man I loved. Then I opened them. I needed to keep my head up. I needed to watch the enemy camp. I turned my gaze slightly to the left toward the adjacent VIP table where my family sat. Bennett did not have his head bowed. He was not observing the memorial tribute to the man whose name was on the charity. Instead, Bennett leaned sideways across the crisp linen tablecloth. His eyes darted around the dim room, checking for observers. He reached into his breast pocket and extracted a thick, gold-embossed business card. With practiced stealth, he slid the card across the table, pressing it directly into the palm of a prominent state senator. The politician glanced at the card, offered a tiny confirming nod, and slipped it into his jacket. A silent transaction, a political favor secured in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. During the literal minute dedicated to mourning my husband, my brother-in-law was brokering a commercial zoning deal. The sheer brazen disrespect stripped away any lingering traces of familial hesitation I might have harbored. The anger inside me stopped burning like a wild flame and hardened into something sharp, cold, and unbreakable. They were parasites feeding on David's memory. "Thank you," the host said, his voice breaking the silence. Heads lifted across the room. The host straightened his posture, shuffling a set of heavy cardstock cue cards resting on the podium. "Tonight marks a new chapter for this foundation." He continued, his tone shifting from somber reflection to uplifting optimism. "In recognition of the monumental effort required to sustain this charity, we are introducing a new tradition. The board of directors has established the inaugural David Thompson Visionary Award. This honor will be bestowed upon an individual who exemplifies the relentless drive required to turn a humble community project into a statewide powerhouse." I listened to his words carefully. The phrasing felt disjointed, wrong. He was not describing a boots-on-the-ground educator. He was not talking about painting community centers or reading to underprivileged children. He was using sterile corporate vocabulary. "We often focus on the face of a charity," the host read from his script, scanning the wealthy crowd. "But true success relies on the quiet force operating behind the scenes. It requires someone who understands political liaison work, an administrative architect who navigates bureaucratic red tape and brokers the major sponsorships that keep the lights on. Tonight, we honor a person who provided that crucial strategic framework. He was rewriting history in real time. He was erasing the 10 years David and I spent driving to rural counties begging for used books. He was replacing our authentic grassroots labor with a narrative of high society networking. When tragedy struck, this organization needed a steady hand. The host proclaimed, his voice rising in volume. This individual stepped into the breach, sacrificing her personal time to ensure the funding never faltered. She is the true driving force behind our recent expansion. The host turned his body, gesturing toward the front row. The main theatrical spotlight swung down from the ceiling. It swept past me, leaving me in the shadows, and settled directly onto the chair occupied by my sister. Please join me in congratulating the co-founder and the first ever recipient of the Visionary Award, Caroline Prescott. The ballroom erupted. The sound of 200 people clapping hit me like a physical wave. Wealthy donors rose to their feet, pushing back their chairs to offer a standing ovation. The state governor smiled warmly, applauding with dignified approval. The regional zoning commissioners cheered. Caroline executed her performance with terrifying perfection. She gasped loudly, her eyes going wide with manufactured shock. Both of her hands flew up to cover her mouth, trembling delicately. She looked at Bennett, who stood up and beamed with fabricated pride, clapping loudly for his wife. Caroline placed a hand over her heart, blinking rapidly to summon a sheen of unshed tears. She looked around the table, making eye contact with her wealthy friends, mouthing the words "thank you" over and over again. It was a masterclass in social manipulation. She was stealing the credit for my husband's life work right in front of my face, bathed in a spotlight she bought with embezzled funds. I did not flinch. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting gracefully on my lap. A few guests sitting at these surrounding tables cast sideways glances in my direction. They expected to see a fragile, weeping widow bursting with gratitude for her heroic sister. I denied them the satisfaction. I offered a serene, unreadable mask. My posture remained rigid, my chin held high. I let my pulse beat a calm, steady rhythm against my collarbone. Let her have the applause. Let her soak in the adoration of the elite. I knew the fundamental rule of gravity. The higher you climb, the more devastating the impact when you fall. Caroline stood up, smoothing the flawless fabric of her midnight blue gown. She turned and began her slow, deliberate walk toward the stage. She glided through the parted sea of standing guests, playing the role of the humble servant. She paused twice to embrace influential board members, pressing her cheek against theirs in a display of practiced intimacy. She reached the wooden stairs and ascended them with the grace of a pageant queen. The host met her at the center of the stage. He handed her the Visionary Award, a massive, heavy teardrop crafted from solid crystal. Caroline cradled the glass trophy in her arms, smiling out at the cheering crowd. The spotlight tracked her every movement, illuminating her triumph. She stepped up to the mahogany podium, placing the crystal award carefully on the wooden ledge. She reached out with her manicured fingers, adjusting the slender neck of the microphone downward to match her height. The applause gradually died down, rippling away until the ballroom returned to a hushed, expectant silence. Behind Caroline, the 20-foot projector screen glowed a pristine blank white. She had given strict instructions for a curated slideshow of her fake philanthropy to play during her acceptance speech. She wanted the wealthy donors to see staged photographs of her handing out pristine new textbooks. I shifted my gaze away from my sister. I looked up through the dim lighting toward the soundproof glass of the audiovisual control booth, perched high above the back wall. I could not see him clearly in the shadows, but I knew Noah was sitting up there. I knew his hand was resting on the computer mouse, hovering right over the trigger for the macro command we discussed. Caroline leaned into the microphone, her lips parted in a humble, triumphant smile. She gripped the edges of the podium, preparing to deliver a speech that would erase my existence and coronate her as the new queen of Charleston High Society. She took a deep breath, ready to speak. She was entirely unaware that the stage she fought so ruthlessly to steal was about to transform into her public scaffold. Caroline leaned into the slender metal stem of the microphone, her breath amplified through the high-definition speakers wrapping around the quiet room. She looked out over the sea of wealthy faces, her expression a masterclass in fabricated grace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying a manufactured tremor of emotion. "I am humbled beyond words to stand before you tonight in this beautiful space." She gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, centering herself under the warm theatrical spotlight. "When we started the Low Country Youth Literacy Project, we had nothing but a vision," she declared. "It required endless sacrifices. I spent countless nights drafting proposals, securing funding, and building the political bridges necessary to keep our doors open. There were times when the administrative burden felt too heavy to bear alone. But I knew the children were counting on me. I knew we were building a future." I sat in the front row, listening to her erase my existence syllable by syllable. She did not draft a single proposal. She did not know the names of the rural teachers or the routes our bookmobiles took. She was wearing my husband's life work like a stolen designer gown, spinning a web of hollow corporate buzzwords to mesmerize the elite crowd. Caroline paused, letting the audience absorb her heroic narrative. She reached up and touched the corner of her eye, tracing a non-existent tear. "The hardest moment of my life was saying goodbye to David." She continued, her voice dropping to a fragile, intimate whisper. "The hospital room was so cold. I sat beside his bed holding his hand during his final hours. He looked at me, his eyes filled with such desperate hope. He squeezed my fingers and he said, "Caroline, you have to protect my dream. Do not let the foundation falter. Promise me you will lead them." The blood turned to ice in my veins. David slipped into a hepatic coma 2 full days before he died. He never woke up. He never opened his eyes. He never spoke a single word in that sterile hospital room. I was the one sitting beside his bed, listening to the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator, praying for a miracle that never arrived. My sister was taking the most agonizing trauma of my life and twisting it into a cheap theatrical prop to justify her corporate theft. The audacity was so breathtaking it bordered on sociopathic. I kept my posture rigid, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. I simply stared at her, waiting for the pendulum to swing back. Caroline smiled, a brave, resilient curve of her lips. She gestured toward the blank 20-foot screen hanging behind her. "I want to share a glimpse of what we have achieved together," she announced. "Please direct your attention to the presentation." I locked my eyes onto the soundproof glass of the audiovisual booth hovering above the back wall. Noah sat in the shadows, barely visible behind the glowing monitors. I offered a single deliberate nod. Caroline turned her body toward the screen, anticipating a pristine slideshow of her staged charity photographs. She expected to see herself handing out shiny new textbooks to smiling children. The projector flared to life, casting a harsh, blinding white square across the canvas. Then the screen snapped to pitch black. The sudden absence of a light plunged the stage into heavy shadows. Caroline frowned, her flawless smile faltering for a fraction of a second. She turned back to the crowd, maintaining her polite composure. She tapped the head of her microphone. The dull, rhythmic thuds echoed through the room. Noah executed the macro command. The green indicator light at the base of the microphone flickered and died. Caroline tapped the metal mesh again. Nothing happened. Dead air enveloped the podium. She looked up toward the control booth, her brow furrowed in genuine irritation. She raised her hand, preparing to signal Noah to fix the supposed technical glitch. She never got the chance to wave. The surround sound speakers crackled with a sharp burst of static. A low, raspy cough echoed through the ballroom, overriding the quiet murmurs of the confused audience. The projector beam sliced through the darkness, hitting the canvas with high-definition clarity. My husband's face filled the 20-foot screen. Gasps erupted from the VIP tables. The state governor sat up straight, spilling a drop of his expensive scotch onto the crisp linen tablecloth. Theodore Sinclair crossed his arms, a grim, satisfied smile settling onto his weathered face. David looked terrible in the footage. His skin carried a haunting grayish hue, and dark circles carved deep hollows under his eyes. He looked exactly like a man standing on the edge of eternity. Katie, his recorded voice, boomed through the country club, carrying an undeniable heavy authority. "If you are watching this, it means my heart finally gave out. The doctors told me yesterday the medication is losing its effectiveness." Caroline froze. Her manicured hands remained gripping the wooden edges of the podium, but her knuckles turned stark white. She whipped her head around, staring up at the massive projection of the man whose legacy she was actively attempting to steal. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand someone turn off the machine, but the dead microphone rendered her entirely voiceless. She waved frantically at the back of the room, her pristine composure shattering into pure primal panic. Noah ignored her. The system was locked. The truth was broadcasting, and nothing could stop it. "I need to put this on the record," David declared, staring directly into the camera lens, judging the entire room from beyond the grave. "You are the sole successor of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project. We built this foundation together, and you are the only person I trust to lead it. I have not filed the official succession paperwork yet because I do not want to alert the board until everything is secure." Caroline stepped away from the podium, her chest heaving in rapid, shallow breaths. She looked desperately toward Bennett, seeking rescue. Bennett was practically paralyzed in his chair. The color had drained from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow wax figure. He stared at the screen, his jaw hanging slightly open. "You cannot trust your sister, Katie. David continued, his tone hardening into a fierce protective warning. You cannot trust Bennett. The ballroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked whispers. Last week, Bennett cornered me after a fundraiser. David explained, his recorded voice echoing off the high ceilings. He pressured me to hand over our private donor registries. He wants to use our philanthropic network to secure commercial zoning permits for his coastal developments. When I refused, Caroline called me. She demanded a seat on the executive board. She said her social connections were the only reason we were successful. Diane Wallace, the regional zoning commissioner, sitting right next to Bennett, slowly pushed her chair away from him. The physical distance she created spoke volumes. She looked at him with a mixture of terror and disgust, realizing her own career was now tethered to a toxic, sinking ship. The wealthy donors, who had just given Caroline a standing ovation, now stared at the stage with revulsion. The illusion was breaking apart, exposing the ugly, rotting truth beneath their polite southern facade. They are circling like vultures, David rasped, shaking his head in disgust. They think because my health is failing, they can orchestrate a quiet takeover. They want the prestige and they want the money. Do not let Caroline near the administrative accounts. Do not let Bennett anywhere near the board of directors. They will bleed this charity dry to fund their own vanity. I love you, Katie. Keep fighting for the kids. The video ended. The screen faded to a quiet, glowing black. The ballroom was silent. It was not the expectant, hushed silence of polite society waiting for a speech. It was a suffocating, heavy silence born from witnessing a brutal, undeniable reality, the kind of silence that marks the end of an era. Caroline stood alone on the wooden stage, trapped in the glaring beam of the theatrical spotlight. She had no slideshow to hide behind. She had no microphone to spin a new lie. The narrative she spent weeks carefully constructing had evaporated in less than 3 minutes, leaving her entirely exposed. She looked down at the heavy Crystal Visionary Award resting on the mahogany podium. The polished glass teardrops seemed to mock her very existence. She reached out with a trembling hand, hovering over the cold surface of the trophy. Her breathing echoed loudly in the quiet room, short, frantic gasps of a predator suddenly realizing she was the prey. She was cornered, ruined in front of the exact high society elite she worshipped. I sat perfectly still in the front row, watching my sister drown in the shallow waters of her own ambition. The social execution was flawless. The elite donors knew she was a fraud. The politicians knew Bennett was a parasite. Their social capital was reduced to ashes. Now it was time for the law to finish the job. The suffocating quiet lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Then the dam broke. The ballroom did not erupt into shouts or screams. Southern high society does not yell. Instead, a tidal wave of hushed, scandalized whispers swept across the sea of round tables. The sound resembled a swarm of locusts descending upon a ruined crop. 200 pairs of eyes shifted from the dark projector screen directly to the woman frozen under the theatrical spotlight. The state governor set his crystal tumbler on the table with a sharp, definitive clink. He buttoned his suit jacket, turned his back on the stage, and walked purposefully toward the exit. He recognized political poison, and he was actively amputating himself from the infection. Diane Wallace, the regional zoning commissioner, shoved her chair backward. The wooden legs screeched against the floorboards. She glared at Bennett with unmasked hatred, realizing her own professional standing was now tainted by his proximity. She snatched her evening bag and followed the governor. Caroline stood trapped in the harsh glare of the stage illumination. Her chest heaved. The polished facade of the humble philanthropist crumbled, leaving behind a terrified social climber caught in her own snare. She looked out at the audience, searching for a single friendly face. She found only cold, judging stares. The same people who gave her a standing ovation 3 minutes ago now looked at her like she was a stain on the ballroom carpet. She needed to run. She needed to escape the judging eyes and salvage whatever dignity remained. Caroline reached out with trembling hands to grab the Visionary Award resting on the mahogany podium. Perhaps she thought carrying the heavy trophy would legitimize her presence. Perhaps her mind was just short-circuiting. Her manicured fingers wrapped around the thick glass teardrop. But her palms were slick with nervous sweat. She lifted the award an inch off the wooden ledge. The heavy crystal slipped from her grasp. The trophy tumbled through the air. It struck the edge of the podium, chipping a chunk of mahogany before plummeting toward the hardwood stage. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The thick glass shattered into hundreds of glittering, jagged shards. The pieces exploded outward, scattering across the polished floorboards and catching the glare of the spotlight. It was a beautiful, devastating metaphor for her ruined social standing. Broken, irreparable, and displayed for everyone to see. Caroline let out a sharp, startled gasp. She stumbled backward, stepping on a shard of broken glass. The sharp edge crunched loudly under her designer heel. She abandoned the podium, gathering the heavy silk fabric of her midnight blue gown in her fists, and hurried down the wooden stairs. She did not head for the main entrance. She darted toward the shadowy left wall, aiming for the swinging metal doors of the kitchen corridor. She was running toward the exact obscure corner where she had tried to hide me earlier that evening. Bennett was already moving. The arrogant real estate developer had shrunk into a cornered coward. He abandoned his half-empty bourbon glass and practically sprinted, weaving through the maze of white roses to intercept his wife. He grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging into her silk sleeve. His face was a mask of pale, sheer panic. He knew the social execution was merely the opening act. He understood that a dying declaration exposing real estate extortion meant federal scrutiny was imminent. "We need to leave right now," Bennett hissed, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. They took 2 steps toward the kitchen exit. The grand double doors at the back of the Magnolia Room swung open with a heavy, dramatic thud. The murmurs inside the ballroom died instantly. Every head turned toward the entrance. Charles Montgomery stepped over the threshold. He wore his signature seersucker suit, projecting an aura of lethal old money authority. He did not look like a lawyer. He looked like an executioner arriving to collect a debt. Flanking him on either side were 4 men wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow lettering on their jackets spelled out the acronym for the State Law Enforcement Division. The polished gold badges clipped to their belts caught the light from the overhead chandeliers. The authorities did not rush. They walked down the center aisle with measured, deliberate strides. The sea of wealthy donors parted for them, pulling their chairs forward to clear the pathway. Theodore Sinclair stood near the front, offering Charles a grim nod of respect as the legal strike team approached the stage. Bennett froze in his tracks. His grip on Caroline loosened. He took a slow, terrified step backward, bumping into a table and sending a silver appetizer tray clattering to the floor. Charles stopped 10 feet away from the cornered couple. The state investigators fanned out, forming a barricade between Bennett and the kitchen exit. Caroline Prescott Charles spoke, his southern drawl echoing loud and clear across the silent ballroom. "My name is Charles Montgomery. I represent the true director of the Low Country Youth Literacy Project." He reached into his breast pocket and extracted a thick, folded legal document. He held it out, extending his arm. "You have been served with a blind injunction authorized by the Attorney General," Charles announced. "Effective immediately, your administrative authority over this foundation is revoked. Furthermore, a judge has frozen every single personal and corporate bank account associated with your name. You cannot access a dime. You cannot sell a share of stock. You cannot even pay for a taxi ride home tonight." Caroline stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. Her flawless makeup was ruined by streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. Her lips trembled, struggling to form a coherent sentence. "This is a misunderstanding," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "I was protecting the charity." A tall investigator with graying hair stepped past Charles. He did not look at Caroline. He locked his eyes onto Bennett. "Bennett Prescott," the investigator said, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with federal wire fraud and the embezzlement of state matching grants." Bennett raised his hands, palms facing outward in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "I am a prominent developer," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You cannot just march in here. I know the precinct captain. I demand to make a phone call." The investigator grabbed Bennett by the wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced efficiency. The metal cuffs clicked shutting with a sharp finality. Your precinct captain does not hold jurisdiction over federal wire fraud, Mr. Prescott. You can make your phone call during booking. The sound of the ratcheting handcuffs echoed through the silent room. The reality of the moment crashed down upon the Charleston elite. They were witnessing the total annihilation of a reigning power couple. I remained seated in the front row watching the wreckage unfold. My emerald green dress felt like a suit of armor. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I simply bore witness to the consequences of their own boundless greed. Caroline watched her husband being hauled away by the state agents. She stood alone, shivering in the freezing air conditioning, holding the injunction papers Charles had pressed into her hands. The photographers hired by the event planner suddenly sprang to life. Camera shutters clicked rapidly, capturing the disgraced socialite standing next to the shattered pieces of her fake award. Her downfall was now permanently etched into the historical record. Charles Montgomery turned his attention away from the ruined couple. He walked over to my table and offered a slight, respectful bow. "The trap is sprung, Kathleen," he murmured quietly. "The accounts are secured." "Thank you, Charles," I replied, my voice steady and resolute. I stood up, turning my back on my sister. I walked down the center aisle, passing the stunned wealthy donors, who now looked at me with a newfound mixture of awe and healthy fear. They realized the quiet archivist was not a fragile ghost. She was the architect of the most devastating public reckoning this city had ever seen. The predators had been cleared from the property. Now it was time to rebuild the foundation the right way. The cold wind swept through the ancient stone pillars. Alara tightened her cloak against the biting chill. The ruins of Oakhaven loomed before them. These broken walls held the secrets she desperately needed to uncover. Cale walked beside her. His footsteps made no sound on the frost-covered ground. He had been silent since the battle at the river crossing. The tension between them was a heavy weight. Alara stopped and looked at him. She asked why he had not spoken a word since morning and if he was injured. Cale paused and did not meet her eyes. He told her he was fine and that they must keep moving. He warned that they had to reach the inner sanctum before nightfall, because Valerius and his hounds would not stay lost forever. Alara shook her head. She refused to take another step until he explained what happened back there. She pointed out that when the shadow creatures attacked, his magic flared. It was not the blue light of the Guardians. It was crimson. It was the exact same color as the magic Valerius uses. Cale sighed deeply and turned to face her. His face looked older in the fading light. His eyes carried a sorrow she had never seen before. He explained that there were things about the old war she did not understand, and things he hoped she would never have to learn. Alara demanded that he tell her. Her voice was firm, and she stood tall. The air around her hummed with her own awakening power. She reminded him that they were supposed to be a team and that he was the one who told her trust was their greatest weapon. She asked how she could trust him if he hid the truth. Cale admitted she was right. His voice was soft. He gestured toward a crumbled archway and suggested they take shelter there because the wind was growing stronger. They moved into the shadow of the archway. It offered a small reprieve from the harsh weather. Cale leaned against the cold stone and crossed his arms over his chest. He explained that long before she was born, the Order of Guardians was divided. They were tasked with protecting the Crystal of Light. But some believed the light was not enough to defeat the darkness. They believed they needed to understand the dark magic to conquer it. Alara listened closely as her heart beat faster. She asked if he was one of them. Cale answered that he was young and arrogant. His voice held a bitter edge. He explained that Valerius was his brother in arms and that they were the best of the Order. They thought they could master the crimson magic without letting it corrupt them. They were wrong. He told her the magic demands a price and feeds on ambition and anger. Valerius gave in to it completely because he wanted to rule, and he destroyed the Order from within. Alara asked what happened to him and if he gave in to the darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat. Cale looked down at his hands. He explained that he stepped back from the edge because he saw what it was doing to Valerius and what it was doing to himself. He renounced the crimson magic and swore to protect the last remaining spark of the true light. He swore to protect her. But he admitted the darkness never truly leaves the blood. When those creatures attacked, he had to use it. He had to draw on that old power to keep her safe. Alara stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. She told him he used it to save her life. She assured him he was not Valerius and that he made a choice to walk away from the darkness. She said that was what mattered. Kale looked up at her and his eyes were wide with surprise. He asked if she feared him. Alara fiercely declared that she feared the man who wanted to burn the world, not the man who had spent his life trying to save it. She then asked him to show her the way to the sanctum because they had a relic to find. A small smile touched the lips of Kale. It was the first time she had seen him smile in days. He told her to follow him. They ventured deeper into the ruins. The air grew thick with ancient magic. The stone walls were covered in glowing runes that pulsed with a faint blue light. Alara felt a strange connection to the writing. It was as if the stones were whispering to her. They were telling her a story of a time before the war when there was peace and prosperity. Suddenly, the ground trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling and a loud roar echoed through the corridors. Kale drew his sword as the metal gleamed in the dim light. He announced they had been found and that Valerius had sent his executioners. Alara raised her hands. Her palms glowed with a brilliant white light. She said to let them come and that they were not running anymore. Two massive figures stepped out of the shadows. They were encased in dark armor and their eyes burned with crimson fire. They carried heavy axes that dripped with a dark substance. The executioners raised their weapons and charged. Kale lunged forward and moved with incredible speed. His sword struck the first executioner with a resounding clash. Sparks flew as metal met metal. Kale ducked under a heavy swing and drove his blade into a gap in the armor. The executioner let out a deafening roar and staggered backward. Alara focused her energy and channeled the light into a powerful beam. She unleashed the beam at the second executioner. The light struck the dark armor and the armor cracked and hissed. The executioner screamed as the purifying light burned away the dark magic holding it together. The massive figure collapsed into a pile of ash and twisted metal. Kale finished off the first executioner with a swift strike to the neck. The creature fell heavily to the ground and the corridor was silent once more. Kale wiped his sword on a piece of cloth and said they could not linger there. He knew Valerius would realize they had fallen and would send more. They hurried down this corridor and arrived at a massive pair of stone doors. The doors were intricately carved with images of celestial bodies. In the center of the doors was a circular depression. Kale pointed and said this was the entrance to the inner sanctum. Alara examined the depression and asked how they could open it since there was no handle and no keyhole. Kale explained that the doors responded only to the true light. He instructed her to place her hand in the center and channel her energy into the stone. Alara placed her hand in the circular depression. The stone was freezing cold. She closed her eyes and reached deep within herself. She found the source of her power, which was the warm and comforting light. She pushed the light down her arm and into her hand. The runes on the doors began to glow brightly. A loud click echoed through the chamber. The massive stone doors slowly swung open, and a blinding light spilled out from the sanctum. Alara and Kale stepped inside. The chamber was vast and circular. The ceiling was a dome of pure crystal that captured the faint light from outside and magnified it 100 times over. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal. Resting on the pedestal was a small and unassuming object. It was a simple silver pendant. Alara whispered and asked if that was the relic. She could feel the power radiating from the pendant, and it was overwhelming. Kale spoke reverently and called it the heart of the first guardian. He approached the pedestal slowly and explained that it contained the pure essence of the light. He told her that with this she could counter the crimson magic and defeat Valerius. Alara reached out. Her fingers hovered over the pendant, but she hesitated. She asked what would happen when she touched it and if it would burn her. Kale answered that it would test her. It would search her soul for any trace of darkness. He warned that if her intentions were pure, it would bond with her, but if not, it would destroy her. Ilara swallowed hard. She thought of the journey and the people she had lost. She thought of the world she wanted to save. Her resolve hardened, and she closed her hand around the silver pendant. A surge of energy rushed through her body. It was a sensation of pure warmth and absolute clarity. The light from the pendant engulfed her. She felt her mind expand and saw visions of the past. She saw the first guardian forging the pendant. She saw the great battles against the darkness. She felt the collective strength of all those who had come before her. The light slowly faded. Ilara opened her eyes and found the pendant was now fused to her chest. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She felt stronger than she had ever felt in her entire life. Kale breathed a sigh of relief and told her she did it. He declared that the light had accepted her as its champion. Ilara looked at her glowing hands and said she understood now what she had to do. She announced they must go to the capital to end this war. Kale agreed they would march at dawn, but insisted they rest tonight. He said she needed to gather her strength because the road ahead would be the hardest they had ever traveled. They set up a small camp in the sanctum. The presence of the relic provided a sense of peace and security. The dark creatures would not dare enter this sacred place. Ilara sat on a stone bench and gazed up at the crystal dome. The stars were beginning to appear in the night sky. She wondered what the future held. She knew that the final battle was approaching and that many would fall. But she also knew that she was ready. Kale sat across from her and sharpened his sword. The rhythmic sound was comforting. Ilara watched him for a moment and asked what he would do when this was all over. Kale stopped sharpening his sword and looked at her. He said he did not know because he had spent his entire life fighting and had never known peace. He mused that perhaps he would find a quiet place in the mountains to finally rest. Ilara told him he deserved peace because he had sacrificed so much for the world and for her. Kale smiled warmly and said protecting her was never a sacrifice. He called it his honor and told her she was the hope they had all been waiting for. The night passed quietly and Ilara slept soundly. The light of the pendant kept her warm and protected her from nightmares. When she woke up, the first rays of dawn were piercing through the crystal dome. She stood up and stretched. She felt energized and ready to face the day. Kale was already awake and had packed their meager supplies. He said it was time. Ilara agreed and they left the sanctum. They stepped back into the cold morning air. The ruins of Oakhaven looked less daunting in the daylight. They walked with a renewed sense of purpose. The journey to the capital would take weeks, and they would face countless dangers along the way. They were no longer just a seasoned warrior and a frightened girl. They were the champion of light and her loyal protector. They were a force to be reckoned with. As they reached the edge of the ruins, Ilara turned back to look at the ancient stones one last time. She knew that her life had changed forever in this place, and that she had found her destiny. She turned back to the path ahead and took a deep breath. She stepped forward into the unknown. The wind seemed to carry a whisper of encouragement. The long shadow of Valerius still loomed over the land, but for the first time, the darkness did not seem so absolute. The light had finally found a way to shine through. The final war for the fate of the realm had truly begun.